Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more witness coming in. We've confirmed that he's in security. So as soon as he gets there, Mr. Cummings and I will start. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of time, we're assured the witness is coming, but we're going to go ahead and begin, and he'll be sworn in separately if he arrives after that. The hearing will come to order. The Oversight and Government Reform Committee exists for two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know what they get for their money. Washington takes from, I'm sorry, bad day. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, America has a right to know what they get. You know, one of those days, I'm going to skip this. I brought the wrong glasses, and I'm really embarrassed. I'm trying to read them, and I can't. Okay. Without the glasses, we exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. And good morning again. Our hearing today is going to scrutinize government agencies and the Federal regulatory process. We not only know on this committee that it is flawed and that it often punishes job creators and stifles economic growth, but President Obama has spoken about and even launched an effort to evaluate regulations that create unnecessary burdens. Regulatory agencies under this administration, though, have gone in the opposite direction. And understand, regulatory agencies under every administration have a push to do more. But under this administration, we have increased from 2,044 in 2009 to 2,439 in 2010. Another way of putting it is they pass more laws than we do here in Congress. Their laws are not subject to accounting in the way that we are. If we cost more money, we have to find offsets. Regulatory agencies have an inherent right to pass on cost to you. We have seen the budgets of these regulatory agencies grow by 16% over the last 3 years. Investors Business Daily summarized, the Federal Government's regulatory operation were a business, it would be the 50th largest in this country in terms of revenue and the 3rd largest in terms of employees. Regulators in America represent a larger workforce than all of McDonald's workers, Ford's workers, Disney's, and Boeing's combined. With 250,000 regulators, there is no question that job security is, by in fact, growing their operation. Employment at regulatory agencies has climbed 13% since President Obama took office, and the number of staff working on regulatory matters is scheduled to increase at a rate of 10,000 new employees per year over the next 2 years. The number of full-time regulators now is expected to reach, in 2012, 291,000. Meanwhile, since President Obama took office, private sector jobs have declined by 5.6%. We don't blame the President for the growth of regulation. We don't blame the President for the loss of jobs. But under his watch, this has occurred. Under our watch, Mr. Cummings and myself, we have an obligation with the President to reverse this trend. The administration has 219 economically significant regulations in the pipeline right now. If finalized, these would cost $100 million or more each year to the economy. That is a minimum cost of $219 billion over 10 years. And understand, when I said that, each of them is significant. Therefore, each of them cost more than $100 million apiece. To date, the administration has already imposed 75 new regulations at a cost of more than $380 billion over 10 years. The business owners and workers who we will hear from today are not Fortune 500 executives. They are Main Street business owners and workers from around the country. They, their families, co-workers, and employees bear the cost of new and proposed regulations. For them, the business around the country has a price greater than just compliance. It is, in fact, a hidden tax, uncertainty, and perhaps the loss of jobs not yet created or jobs that will not be retained. An uncertain regulatory climate breeds a market of uncertainty, forcing job creators' capital to wait on the sidelines. Making matters worse, the Federal agencies charged with serving as a watchdog over Federal rulemaking, ORIA, has failed to take meaningful action to address the breakdown in this process. One of our questions today will be, if an agency says something is not economically significant, meaning less than $100 million, and later that's proven to be flawed, is there going to be a do-over, or do we simply assume that we didn't catch that one and it becomes law without the scrutiny of its economic impact? Today we will hear from Administrator Susstein and expect him to address specific details of why and how this has happened and what we can do to fix it. I would like to take note that the written testimony he will provide to the committee fails to answer the questions that we have asked. I intend to ask Mr. Sunstein, thank you, to explain how the regulatory process can be circumvented, ignored, or openly flaunted by the bureaucracy in a manner contrary to direction given by the President. Thus far, the rhetoric we have seen from the Obama administration on the issue of regulatory reform has not matched its deeds. But we take the President at his word. We intend to assist in seeing that under our watch and under the President's watch, we reverse this trend. And in order to be fair to the ranking member, I will put the rest of my opening statement in at this time, and I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for calling this hearing. I think every member of our committee would agree that creating jobs should be our committee's #1 priority. The question is whether we can develop bipartisan solutions we can all support. When I go home to my district, only 40 miles away from here, my constituents tell me we need to find common ground. We need to focus on concrete proposals, and we need to pass them now. More than 7 months ago, as one of my first actions as a ranking member, I wrote to the Chairman requesting that the committee hold hearings on an initiative proposed by President Obama in his State of the Union address. The proposal was to create jobs and strengthen the economy by investing in America's infrastructure. This proposal was endorsed by both the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO. As I said at the time, and I quote, "These are exactly the kinds of bipartisan constructive initiatives our committee and Congress should support," end of quote. When the Chairman decided not to hold that hearing, I placed my statement into the record during a hearing just like this one, which focused on regulations. Since then, we have held 20 more hearings on regulations, but we have held few hearings on bipartisan proposals to create jobs. In his speech to Congress and to the nation last week, President Obama renewed his call for bipartisan action on his infrastructure proposal to create jobs by rehabilitating homes, businesses, and communities, investing in a national infrastructure bank, modernizing 35,000 schools, and expanding access to high-speed wireless. As I said in a hearing yesterday, we have to be very careful in our country, because if we do not improve our infrastructure, we will be destroyed from the inside. On Friday, I sent another letter to the Chairman urging the committee to hold hearings on the President's infrastructure proposal as well as other components of the American Jobs Act. I hope this committee will hold these hearings, and I hope we can be part of a helpful, positive solution. With respect to regulations, I support a balanced and thorough review designed to improve regulations. I think there is no member of this committee that would be against that. One of the things that we must ask as we approach this is, will we get rid of regulation, and what guarantees that jobs will be created? Will we be in a situation where we have no regulations, businesses are making big money because they've gotten rid of the regulations, benefits of the regulations are gone, companies are making all kinds of money, and our poverty rate goes up, as was reported just yesterday, at an alarming rate? But as I have said before, I strongly believe that any responsible effort to review regulations must consider both costs and benefits. Today, we will not hear a balanced view, by the way. Instead, we will hear a lopsided view about why some groups believe certain regulations are flawed. This approach narrows the information received by the committee and serves neither the regulatory process nor the public interest. If a regulation is problematic, we should hear that. But to ignore the benefits only fuels cynicism about how we do business in this nation. On a broader level, repealing health and safety regulations is no silver bullet. With all due respect to our witnesses from the Association of Reptile Keepers, repealing a so-called job-killing regulation to allow more pythons, boa constrictors, and anacondas into the United States is not the kind of bold, bipartisan solution Americans are looking for to help the economy. I am also concerned that the committee may be expanding attacks on agencies charged with protecting American workers. This week, a witness was added to the hearing at the last minute. Apparently, he is a plaintiff in an ongoing lawsuit against the National Mediation Board, who is objecting to rule changes under the Railway Labor Act. The District Court for the District of Columbia has already ruled against this plaintiff, but his case is scheduled to be appealed next week. In my opinion, it is time to work together and take action on proposals we should all be able to support. That is what the American people want. Mr. Chairman, with this in mind, I want to ask you if I can work together with you and with the other members of our committee to develop a joint bipartisan committee report with recommendations to the supercommittee on reducing the debt and increasing the jobs. As you know, the law was established that established a supercommittee, gave the committee, our committee, the option of submitting such a report by October the 14th. I think we should make a much more responsive contribution if we submit one together. We would make a much more responsive committee contribution if we did it together, with recommendations on which we all can agree on. And I would ask, Mr. Chairman, if you would agree to do that. I think it's very important. I think we have a lot to contribute, particularly with the jurisdiction of our committee.
I thank the gentleman. In full answer to his question, I would certainly hope that we would submit joint suggestions, and each of us, if necessary, submit separate suggestions. I think that all of our comments, both the majority and minority, and those which we can both agree on, should be submitted for the committee's approval, and I thank the gentleman for it. With that, I would like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, the chairman of the Transportation Committee, Mr. Mica, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Cummings, for convening this important oversight hearing on regulations and its effect. I was thinking, how do you get all these regulations? And we're deluged with thousands of Federal regulations. And here's how we get them. It was great to follow Mr. Cummings because he's on the Transportation Committee. He talked about transportation. Now, this is the list of current surface transportation programs and bureaucracy. This is what we deal with on our committee and our jurisdiction. Look at them, dozens and dozens. It started from less than a dozen programs. Now, every one of these programs, they have to produce rules and regulations. So just look at this chart and then look at what these people have to do. So one of the first things you have to do is collapse some of the bureaucracy. Some of these are duplicate activities and actually passing out all kinds of regulations that people have to deal with. Then the results are very important. And if you take something like Mr. Cummings talked about, transportation projects, what the President talked about, we can throw all the money we want at programs and try to say we're going to put people to work in transportation. Here's the problem we face, and shovel-ready has become a national joke. This is why it's become a national joke, because it just in this one chart here, you see it takes you about 6 years to pass to comply with regulations to get any kind of transportation project that involves the Federal government. 6 years. So shovel-ready has become just a joke because you can't do it. We've proposed actually to reduce the time if you could do some approvals concurrently rather than consecutively, so we're not accused of running over any environmental standards or regulations, and many of these things are important to comply with. But this is what you have to comply with now, all these rules and regulations to do a simple project. So the rule of thumb is if the Federal government gets involved, the project takes 3 times as long and costs 3 times as much. Then if you're trying to shovel money into these projects, which we've tried to do, and we have the latest proposal for what, $450 billion, of which only 12% is transportation and infrastructure, you're going to run into the same problem they ran into last time. How many times do you hit your head against the wall and get a different result? But 35% of the $63 billion, $63 billion was the total out of $787 billion that went for infrastructure, $63 billion. 35% September 1st was still in Washington, D.C. They couldn't even spend it because of the regulations that that inhibit the ability to move forward with the project. So we've got to change both the scope of the bureaucracies we've created, then we've got to reduce the regulations, or at least find some way to move forward in a coherent fashion if you want compliance, and people do want compliance with certain things in a reasonable fashion. And that's what we're going to have to do. But I'm glad you brought up the subject, Mr. Cummings, and thank you, Mr. Issa, for holding this hearing.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
We usually don't have additional opening statements, but I thank the gentleman because you came well prepared, and because hopefully this committee, which represents the job impediments that every committee of Congress deals with, will benefit from that. And I want to especially thank you.
And this is just a little microcosm, transportation, but I mean, you all serve on different committees and deal with different issues in your communities, and you see how we're strangling the nation in bureaucracy and regulations, and we've got to attack both, and this is a good start. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I think the President had it right in the State of the Union address when he talked about regulation and they're finding a middle ground. We can avoid unnecessary regulation. We can avoid duplicative regulation. It's a tough task, but it's important to do. But I do think that there are mindsets, and there's legislation that's designed to eliminate any new regulation and to demonize it. So what I try to do is remind folks in this manner. Try not to think about regulation at the Federal, State, or local level the next time you get on a commuter airliner. How much sleep has that pilot had? Try not to think about it if you're a miner in West Virginia, if you attend a state fair, you're a fisherman in the Gulf of Mexico, or if you come to my town, Chicago. If you breathe in Chicago, where we are the asthma, morbidity, and mortality capital of the United States, the next time we have an ozone alert. If you want to put it off, wait till lunch when you have a turkey sandwich, or tomorrow morning when you have your eggs. About 1 in 6 Americans has food poisoning every year, 1 million cases of salmonella. Or if you just have a drink of water in Chicago, where chromium levels are 3 times the healthy limit, and lead levels are surprisingly high, depending on where you are, based on the distribution system. So I recognize that regulation isn't going to solve all our problems, but we have to constantly remind ourselves it shouldn't be just the day after a catastrophe that we say, well, we needed more government regulation. It's an even stream throughout our lives, recognizing that critical balance, not demonizing it, not cutting it off at the knees with lack of funding, but recognizing that middle balance that keeps us safe, keeps us healthy, because those catastrophes, those illnesses, those deaths cause us money, jobs, and it hurts the economy. I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yield.
I yield.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, if regulations and economic growth were inversely related, then sub-Saharan Africa would have the most productive economy on earth. If regulations and economic growth were inversely related, then economic growth would have accelerated during the Bush administration and shrunken during the Clinton administration. In fact, mean household income today has declined to what it was in 1997. If an efficacious National Labor Relations Board actually impeded economic growth, then the 1950s and 1960s would not have produced the most sustained growth in middle-class incomes in American history. In reality, there is no empirical basis for the claim that government regulation and economic growth are incompatible or even inversely related. In fact, the evidence seems to suggest the contrary. Consider the automotive industry. For decades, the Big Three successfully resisted legislative efforts to establish meaningful fuel efficiency standards. Their success resisting legislation contributed directly to American automobiles losing market share to more efficient vehicles produced in Asia. Today, following a Federal rescue, General Motors and Chrysler automotive manufacturers are deploying more efficient, more competitive products consistent with Federal regulation. Certainly, Mr. Mica has a point that we can find ourselves in a regulatory bind in which regulation goes amok or becomes counterproductive. But the idea that somehow it's all or nothing is an unacceptable economic proposition. And as my colleague from Illinois just pointed out, from a human health point of view, regulation is essential because the marketplace is not self-correcting. Mr. Cummings made reference to the fact that we are now reduced in this 22nd hearing on regulation, propounding this ideology that regulation is strangling the American economy, and if we only released it from regulation, jobs would flow and all would be well. We are now reduced to the point of actually hearing, no disrespect, Mr. Barker, about reptiles and how intrusive Federal regulation is in trying to protect the Everglades from now seeing pythons becoming an endemic species, killing off all kinds of flora and fauna that are native to the Everglades, and the fear that we have actually lost the battle because of lack of control, not because of too much control, of the importation of dangerous and foreign species into the United States. So I look forward to the hearing, Mr. Chairman, but I certainly reject the premise. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. All members will have 7 days to submit additional opening statements and extraneous material for the record. We now recognize our first panel of witnesses. Dr. John Graham is Dean of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. He served as the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the Office of Management and Budget from 2001 to 2008, and at that time it was easier to get through security here. You have our apologies for the trouble you had. Mrs. Roby LaValle, is the co-owner of Homestead Meats, a direct meat marketing business that has been in operation since 1995. Hopefully there are no PETA people objecting to what you do. Mr. David Arkush is the Director of Congress Watch at Public Citizen. Thank you, a returning guest. Mr. David Barker is owner of Vida Preciosa. Actually, I understand it translates to Precious International, a business specializing in research and captive breeding of pythons and boas. And I could do too much talking about those being two of the names in my old alarm company, but we'll stay off of that for today. And Mr. Matthew Palmer, who is a flight attendant at Delta Airlines, testifying in his own behalf. And I will support the gentleman, the ranking member's statement. We do not have witnesses here to talk specifically about their litigation or to support their litigation. We agreed to have you here. We think it's appropriate because of your experience relative to the effect at Delta. But please understand that we will limit on both sides of the aisle questions to not specifically pertain to any litigation. Pursuant to the committee rules, all witnesses are to be sworn. Would you all rise to take the oath? Raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record indicate that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. Now, Dr. Graham, you know the routine here pretty well, but for the rest of you, your entire opening statements, all of your printed material, and any additional material you choose to present to the committee will be included in the record. So pretty close to exactly 5 minutes you'll be given to make an opening statement. You can read from your prepared notes. We strongly suggest that you use this time, though, to expand on what you've already presented to us so that both may be part of the record. You'll see the light in front of you, basically pretty straightforward. If it's green, you're fine. If it's yellow, wrap up. If it's red, please stop at the end of the full sentence and no run-on sentences. With that, Dr. Graham. Oh, and then there is that thing about if you hit the button twice, it'll be off again. So, and then when you're finished, turn it off so the next person doesn't have an echo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. The hearing this morning occurs at a time of our country in economic distress. The unemployment rate was 5% in early 2008. It rose to over 10% in October of 2009. Last year, it appeared the recovery was on the way, but now we appear to be stuck around 9% unemployment. And as Mr. Cummings mentioned, we learned today about 15% of Americans are now officially recorded to be in poverty. Any sustained recovery has to have two basic things: fewer layoffs of people and more business investment and hiring. What's the connection to the regulatory system? It's been well accepted for decades that the regulatory climate affects how businesses and consumers think about their future decisions and their investments. Right now, virtually all major sectors of our economy are facing potentially big new regulatory burdens. I refer to manufacturing, mining, energy, agriculture, and even higher education are all about to be subject to substantial new regulatory programs. Is the Obama administration and OIRA in a good position to handle these issues? I think we are in a good news, bad news situation. The good news is President Obama has personally and publicly expressed concern about the need for regulatory reform, and he has put OIRA to work to try to streamline some existing regulations. He has also recently returned publicly a regulation to the Environmental Protection Agency that deals with ozone on the grounds that it is not a good timing from the standpoint of the economy. The Obama administration also has an administrator of OIRA, Cass Sunstein, a talented and deeply knowledgeable person about regulatory issues and about cost-benefit analysis. The bad news we face at the time is that there's clear evidence that the number of costly regulations coming out of the Federal Government is on the rise. And perhaps more troubling, the number of costly regulatory proposals that are in the agendas of the agencies are also on the rise. And this is the prospect that's of concern to people who care about the relationship of regulation and the economy. Now, in fairness to the administration, their argument will be, and you've heard some of this morning already, that the benefits of these regulations are also growing. And in fact, in some cases, these benefits are larger than the costs. So maybe in some sense, we're doing better even though we're feeling worse. My concern, however, is that the numbers we're talking about in terms of benefits and costs, it's the agencies, the regulators who generate these numbers. And if OMB and OIRA do not police these numbers, they can tell a very rosy story even though the facts are in fact not in their favor. A related concern I have is if you look at the actual record of the administration in returning regulations to agencies due to poor cost-benefit analysis, there is not a single case of a public return letter to a regulatory agency now almost 3 years into this administration due to poor cost-benefit analysis. I included in my written statement an example where President Bush and President Obama basically agreed on a regulatory issue, the higher mileage standards for cars and trucks. And what I did is I showed you how the benefit and cost estimates for these regulations have changed simply in the two administrations. And all of a sudden, the benefits of these mileage standards are much more substantial than they used to be. I'm not sure that these changes in the way the benefit estimates are made have a good scientific or economic foundation, but we are told now by the regulators that these mileage standards are much more beneficial than they used to be. There are also very interesting, peculiar things going on in these regulations. You look, for example, at manufacturers who are considering whether to put a hybrid engine in or a diesel engine in or a natural gas engine in their cars. We now have a proposal from the Obama administration that if they do an electric car, they get to count that car as 2 vehicles instead of 1 for compliance purposes. And they're also allowed to count that vehicle as if it emits 0 pollution for 5 model years, even though we all know that pollution to some extent is generated back at the power plant where the electricity comes from, and clearly that should be included in this type of analysis. So my concern is the kinds of issues that OIRA and OIRA staff are typically very diligent about The cost-benefit analysis underlying these rules, it's not as vigilant as I think it needs to be, and this committee needs to take a very strong interest in how these analyses are done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for being the consummate professional on the 5-minute rule. Mrs. Lee-Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings. I have been a beef producer all of my life, and my 2 boys represent the 4th generation on our ranch. In addition to our ranch, my family and I are co-owners of Homestead Meats, a direct beef marketing business that owns and operates a packing plant regulated by USDA. So not only do I produce high-quality cattle, I also took the initiative to process and package beef in order to provide a great eating experience for my customers. Our business is built on relationships and marketing alliances that allow me to produce a high-quality beef that my customers demand, quality for which we get paid a premium for. The proposed GIPSA rule, however, will cripple our ability to market cattle the way we want, impacts our small business model, and limits consumer choices. I strongly believe in the fundamental American business tenet of a willing buyer and seller being able to enter into a private business contract, because it protects my cattle marketing contracts and it is the heart of our small business. GIPSA believes my contract should be approved by the government and posted on the Internet. It goes on to say that because I am part owner in a packing plant, I should not be able to sell my cattle to other packers. This provision violates privacy and limits business opportunities. For years, USDA has promoted exactly what we are doing: sell direct to the consumer, operate as a packing plant in a strategic area of the country, and produce local food. We responded to consumer demand, we followed USDA's lead, and now we are being punished. This is a slap in the face to innovative businessmen and women across the U.S. The proposed GIPSA rule offers neither clarity nor clear definition in terminology. Elimination of the competitive injury requirement will provide a disincentive for value-added marketing because of fear of litigation. The vague definitions such as unfair or reasonable person will open the door to an increased number of lawsuits, because mere accusations without economic proof are enough for USDA or an individual to bring lawsuits against a buyer. This will be a trial lawyer's dream and will cause cattle prices to spiral downward. Does increased government intervention and litigation determine fairness, and who pays for this? Cattle producers will pay. What happens to every other industry when litigation increases? Creativity, partnerships, balance, and the desire to take a chance end, which is the very basis of the entrepreneurial spirit of the American business owner. Do you truly want that for the beef industry or the livestock industry? This rule requires buyers of cattle to justify the price paid for my livestock. And what will be the justification, and who sets that? This regulation seems to infer that it is the role of big government, and I strongly oppose the government setting or justifying the prices paid for my cattle. I have serious concerns about the process behind this rule. As you know, the rule is a result of language included in the 2008 Farm Bill. However, we believe the rule published goes beyond the intent of Congress because it includes provisions that are similar to ones that were defeated by votes on the Senate floor or through subcommittee or through committee action. This rule did not include a cost-benefit analysis. NCBA was one of several groups that commissioned an independent analysis by Informa Economics to look at the impact. The report concluded this rule would result in the loss of over 23,000 jobs, annual GDP loss of $1.6 billion, and annual tax revenue losses of $360 million. This is well over the $100 million threshold to be considered economically significant. But the rule was not treated that way. We appreciate the letter sent by 147 members of the House of Representatives asking for a full cost-benefit analysis. But Secretary Vilsack has said the analysis won't be open for review or comment. The report also estimates annual cost of $62 million just to cattle producers alone. Overall, we believe the process in formulating the rule is flawed and broken. Value-based marketing has given our family and given families across the United States the business opportunity to compete for market share at the highest level. It accounts for 62% of the actual cattle contracts across the United States is value-based marketing. We do not need big government setting up shop on our farms and ranches, and government intrusion into the private marketplace is not the answer. I urge the committee to help stop this rule from being finalized as is detrimental to ranchers, consumers, and the entire U.S. economy. Thank you.
And thank you. Mr. Arkush?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think all of us here agree that the regulatory process is in some sense broken. I disagree, I think, with a lot of people here on how exactly it's broken. What I see in the record before this committee is strong evidence of enormous net benefits to health, safety, and the economy. And given those benefits, it's surprising that we make it so hard for our public protection agencies to do their jobs. So on the benefits of regulations, there are obvious, enormous human benefits from public protections. We're talking about millions of lives, people's health, children's IQ points, clean air, clean water. I have a lot of specifics in my written testimony. I'm not going to go into that in any greater depth. It's controversial to try to put these benefits in narrow economic terms because it's hard to put a price tag on them. It's easy to understate benefits when we look at them monetarily, and it's easy to overstate costs. But even when you look at regulation and evaluate it through this narrow lens of economic cost-benefit analysis, the benefits are overwhelming, and they overwhelm the costs consistently. The authoritative resource on this is the annual report from OMB to the Congress evaluating the past 10 years' major regulations. Across both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, these reports have come out every single year showing massive, overwhelming benefits of regulations compared to their costs. The most recent report showed that on average, over the last 10 years, health, safety, and environmental regulations have had benefits 7 times as great as their costs. That's a 700% return on investment. It's hard to find that kind of return on investment anywhere in the United States, but you can find it from our regulatory agencies. An often overlooked benefit of regulations is that they can drive innovation. As Mr. Connolly was saying in his opening remarks, the auto industry, by fighting fuel economy standards for 2 decades, put itself at a severe disadvantage when consumer preferences shifted and consumers desired much more fuel-efficient vehicles, and the U.S. auto industry had a disadvantage compared to foreign manufacturers who had been focusing on fuel economy. Fuel economy standards would have forced auto manufacturers to make the decisions that it turns out consumers actually wanted and bring their fuel standards into the 21st century. Another often missed benefit of regulation is that it can actually help grow jobs. In the current economy, our principal problem is a lack of demand. A lot of companies have idle cash sitting around that they're not investing in their businesses because they're afraid that if they invest in new products or services, there won't be any demand for those products or services. It's a good time to enact public protections that will bring those industries into the 21st century in terms of environmental protections or worker protections, and in the process, use that idle cash to buy upgrades in equipment or hire service people or build other improvements to processes that will boost the economy and create jobs. We also shouldn't overlook the harms of deregulation. The big example in this area recently is the financial crisis. The financial sector was deregulated over the past several decades, and in short order it collapsed on itself. It imploded under the weight of its own reckless and predatory practices in the absence of good government oversight. The costs are hard to overestimate in this area. We are 11 million jobs behind where we should be in the United States economy, if not for the Great Recession. The financial crisis evaporated trillions of dollars worth of wealth and cost billions and trillions of dollars of government bailouts and other supports. So here's how the system is broken. Given all the benefits of regulation and given the severe harms of underregulation, we make it far too hard for our public protection agencies to do their jobs. The agencies that protect our health, safety, and environment are some of the most heavily regulated entities in the United States. They have to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act, which creates paperwork, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, the Congressional Review Act, several executive orders, and they are subject to judicial review. In all, there are as many as 110 requirements an agency needs to comply with just to write a rule. As a result, even when an agency wants to write a simple, non-controversial rule, it can take up to 10 years. My organization published a report earlier this year talking about one of those examples. The construction industry got together with labor unions and public interest groups. Everybody thought we needed a new rule to protect crane safety. It still took 10 years to produce because of the burdens on OSHA. Here's the important point. When rules have massive economic benefits, there are equally massive costs when we delay the creation of those rules. On average, the OMB estimates that the benefits of rules outweigh the costs by $9 to $59 billion a year. That means that when we delay major rulemakings by 1 year, we are costing the U.S. economy $9 to $59 billion. We need to give public protection agencies the resources they need to do their jobs, and we need to reduce unnecessary burdens on them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Barker. If you turn your mic on.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is David Barker. I'm a published herpetologist and an entrepreneur engaged in the breeding and sales of pythons and boas. I am grateful for this opportunity to relate some of the problems, legal shortcomings, and job-killing aspects of the Interior Department's and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's proposal to add 9 species of large snakes to the injurious wildlife list under the Lacey Act. A listing under the Lacey Act makes it a federal crime to import or export these species or move them across state lines. And this would be the first time a species in common pet ownership was so listed. The Fish and Wildlife Service has not considered the economic impact of this listing, failing, as the Small Business Administration Office of Advocacy noted, to fulfill its duties under the Regulatory Flexibility Act. The proposed action also constitutes an inappropriate taking of property, impacting as many as 1 million Americans. Finally, it is based on an insubstantial scientific analysis that has not withstood scrutiny or subsequent review. Taking that last issue first, the basis for the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed action can be traced back to a paper published in early 2008 concluding that pythons would find the climate of the southern third of the continental United States to be favorable, and predicting that these pythons were likely to invade the United States all the way from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. The 2 past cold winters have now laid to rest that fear. Pythons and boas will not survive anywhere in the continental United States except extreme southern Florida. In the past 2 years, there are 4 published papers that describe how pythons fail to survive in cold weather, and 3 of those papers are co-authored by government biologists and academics contracted by the Interior Department agencies. Secondly, the proposal to invoke the Lacey Act is not a valid use of this federal criminal statute. The simple truth is that the proposed action, 1, will not solve or correct any problem regarding these snake species in South Florida, and 2, it will destroy American businesses and it will damage hundreds of thousands of people economically, and 3, it threatens as many as 1 million law-abiding American citizens and their families with the penalty of a felony conviction for pursuing their livelihoods, for pursuing their hobby, or for simply moving with their pet to a new state. States should be allowed the freedom to regulate this industry as they see fit without heavy-handed federal intervention. In my own personal circumstance, if the proposed action is implemented, it will directly and negatively affect my wife's and my incorporated small business and our family income. It will destroy more than 20 years of work, and it essentially confiscates the value of our investments in breeding stock and equipment, and it removes all value to our colony of breeding animals. It will stop all of our interstate and international business, which is 90% of our business. It will immediately reduce our family income by 35% or more at a time when income and work come hard. It will likely ruin our retirement. And additionally, our business is interconnected with many other local businesses, large and small, that will be negatively affected. There are thousands of other families with small snake breeding businesses similar to ours. The Fish and Wildlife Service utterly failed to take any hard look at these economic impacts, and they failed to consider reasonable alternatives to federal regulation that were offered by my industry. As the Office of Advocacy noted, the agency failed to meet its most basic duties under the Regulatory Flexibility Act. Finally, a little discussed issue regards the disaster that may follow the implementation of this proposed rule. What's going to happen to the million or so animals that suddenly are without value? Many, of course, may be maintained into the future by their current owners, but what will be the outcome for the animals that are suddenly unwanted or unaffordable? The proposed action makes no provision for the disposal of these animals. Zoos will not take even one of them. Animal shelters are completely unprepared and generally without trained staff, equipment, cages, or food. The implementation of the proposed action may precipitate the greatest slaughter of pet animals in American history. I thank the opportunity I thank the committee for this opportunity to voice my concerns, and if there are any questions, I will do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Palmer.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
We agree.
Thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Matthew Palmer, and I'm a proud Delta flight attendant. I began my career with Delta in 2008 and have been based both in New York City and Atlanta. I've had the privilege of visiting 5 continents and seeing more than 20 countries. I've carried celebrities, common folk, and even shared jet service to D.C. with President Jimmy Carter en route to President Obama's inauguration. A number of my colleagues, other Delta flight attendants, both pre-merger Northwest and Delta alike, are here with me who have, like me, been harmed by government regulation. Combined, all of us have hundreds of years of experience as Delta flight attendants. My colleagues at Delta Airlines have 3 times in the past decade been involved in representational elections. Each time, the Association of Flight Attendants were seeking to bargain on our behalf. AFA has failed each time to secure the votes of confidence needed to step into that role. The first 2 of these elections were conducted according to the 75-year-old former rules of the National Mediation Board and the Railway Labor Act, rules supported by both Republican and Democratic administrations. That leads to my main concern. A new rule arranged by union insiders and pushed through by the NMB has changed the election landscape despite strong objections from both airlines and, more importantly, from thousands of employees who do not want forced union representation. The NMB changed the election procedures to enable unions to be certified with a minority of a work group. There was no change to the archaic decertification process, which is convoluted at best and requires a, quote, straw man posing as a union to win an election. In fact, decertification has never been successfully used in a large employee group in the airline and railroad industries. When Delta and Northwest were merging into the world's largest airline, all signs indicated that the world's largest flight attendant union, the AFA, was in backdoor dealings with board members Linda Pachala and Harry Hoaglander, both of whom previously served as AFL-CIO union officials with the AFA and Airline Pilots Association, respectively. The Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO during this time secretly petitioned the NMB for a change in the voting rule to organize a union. This was not disclosed to the pre-merger Delta flight attendants who was intended to affect, and more shocking, not to the pre-merger Northwest flight attendants who were actually represented them by the AFA, despite the fact that AFA President Patricia Friend served as Secretary of the Transportation Trades Department herself. Call me foolish, but I believe she should effectively communicate this to her members. Patricia Friend did not. So even with the rules tilted in the favor of the unions, in the most recent election, 94% of Delta flight attendants turned out to vote, and the majority voted to reject AFA representation once again. Following, the AFA then had the gall to say that the high turnout rate indicated Delta interfered in the election. Their argument apparently was that too many people voted. Now, the same 2 members who discarded 75 years of precedent are considering requests from the unions to now disregard how we voted and now force us to redo elections under rules that are even more favorable to unions. Mr. Chairman, I want the NMB to respect our vote. I want them to respect the votes of the majority of Delta flight attendants and Delta employees and other work groups who prefer to have a direct relationship with our company. I believe the majority of my coworkers agree with me that workers should make decisions about their representation, and a government agency such as the NMB should not impose its judgment on employees. Rather, they should be a neutral referee of elections. We have been held hostage by the NMB and the union for 3 years since our merger. Our pre-merger employee groups, some of which are here today, are forced to be kept separate, so we are not able to get the full benefits of our merger. I cannot speak for Delta Airlines, and I will not pretend to. In fact, despite my testimony echoing that of many of my colleagues at Delta, what I have said is only my reality. Frankly, I don't care whether one is pro-union or not. What I am concerned about is the fact of my pay, my work rules, my stock, my livelihood, my friends, my colleagues, and our system of government are all being affected by the partisanship of this board working to do the bidding of unions for whose elections they're supposed to be neutral. They're biased, and they should not be. All should agree it's time that they be reined in. I would like to thank the committee for their time.
Thank you. Thank you all for your statements, and near record that everybody was right there at or below the 5 minutes, which helps all of us. And I would caution all of my colleagues, we will do the same on our questions. With that, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Or with that, we'll now entertain document unanimous consent, if you're ready.
I'll just submit it when I...
Oh, you will? Okay. Well, then I'll submit during my opening statement. I'm asking unanimous consent that the Committee on Oversight's staff report prepared for this hearing be accepted without objection. You have the other one? Yeah. Additionally, I'm submitting for unanimous consent letters in support of the GIPSA position. Saval's position. So, without objection, so ordered, and I'll now get past that procedure. Dr. Graham, I'm concerned about something that's not directly related to this, but I am concerned, as Mr. Palmer and others have been, about circumventing, Mrs. Lee Valley, circumventing the process. Isn't one of the areas that's growing in circumventing sue and settle, not just at the EPA, but throughout government, in which if you settle a case, you effectively bypass all of the protections that are being complained about not being complied with here today?
That's a good question. My experience when I was at OMB at OIRA is that the agencies and the Justice Department are responsible for developing these settlement agreements that commit agencies to doing certain regulations and in some cases to doing very specific content of regulation. Those consent decree arrangements do pose a problem for OMB because in a sense OMB is not, it doesn't have a seat at the table when those consent decrees are signed.
And they're agreed to without scoring, effectively.
Well, and there's no cost-benefit analysis to what they're agreeing to. There is no legal analysis as to what they're agreeing to that's independent of the parties who are at that table itself. So it puts OMB in a difficult position then to be having to review independently and objectively a regulation that is emerging from a consent decree process where OMB was not a participant.
Isn't that also true that when agencies do guidance rather than rulemaking, the same occurs, that implementing that guidance, there's no cost benefit? It's just basically if you don't comply, then the regulatory system can hurt you, while at the same time guidance, although theoretically not compelling, can cost those regulated entities a lot of money?
Yes, in the bargaining and game between regulators and OMB, and of course that's a daily occurrence in this town. The regulators know that if they do a rule, they have to get OMB approval. But if they just issue a policy statement or a guidance or an enforcement suggestion, these types of documents aren't covered by the executive order and are not typically reviewed by OMB and are certainly not subject to cost benefit.
Lastly, during your, or not lastly, but one other question, during your time through OMB, isn't it true that if guidance is implemented, then one of the justifications for rulemaking is it's already being done and therefore there's no incremental cost? Isn't that sort of the other part of the back door, that often compliance to a guidance mitigates the cost and then it makes it easier to go to OMB for rulemaking after the fact?
Certainly the agency can say, we've got our foot in the door, we've already got this experience with this, we're just trying to make it mandatory now, since we're already doing it through guidance, supposedly. But in a lot of cases, the guidance is itself de facto mandatory because there's an enforcement arm behind it.
Lord knows that if the FDA suggests something and you've got drugs pending, it's pretty hard not to take their suggestion. Dr. Graham, I'm going to note Mrs. Lee Valley's statement and predicament. During your time in government, if you found that there was a circumvention of a cost benefit. In other words, something cost a lot more than $100 million, perhaps much more than $1 billion. It's discovered after the fact, and then a cabinet says, well, too bad, we're not going back to look at it. Although you were powerless to absolutely stop that, what would have been the position of any previous administration when you discover that less than $100 million has become more than $1 billion and it wasn't taken into consideration? Dr. Graham, Mrs. Lee-Valley, she has told us pretty well that what's happening to her, but would this have happened in any previous administration that you know of?
No, but it is a situation that's of concern, without doubt.
Okay. Mr. Barker, I'm not necessarily a fan of your particular advocation, but I do have an interesting question for you. Has there been any finding behind this that any of the reptile that you have produced have ever caused any damage for which this proposed rule would be a cure? If you turn the mic on.
No.
Okay.
It wouldn't. The animals are widespread. They're found in 49 states in the United States. They're held by more than 1 million American citizens. The Lacey Act won't. The problem is a state problem that exists only in southern Florida, and this is an inappropriate law that will have no effect whatsoever.
If I had more time, I'd have more questions. With that, I recognize the ranking.
I want to pick up exactly where the Chairman left off. Mr. Barker, your group, the U.S. Association of Reptile Keepers, opposes the proposed rule from the Fish and Wildlife Service that bans the import and export of some dangerous snakes. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you raised your concerns during the formal notice and comment period, again at an ORA meeting, did you not? Did you do that? Have you raised these objections before?
Yes, in the public comment period, yes.
That is right. And are you aware that, and I asked you unanimous consent to this letter of September 13th, directed to the Chairman from 14 organizations, including the Audubon Society of Florida, be admitted into the record?
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Did you realize that there are organizations from Florida in the Everglades that are begging for these regulations? And let me just quote this letter, and by the way, it's from the Audubon Society of Florida, Florida Wildlife Federation, Everglades Foundation, and I could go on and on. But it says, Florida's experience demonstrates that states would benefit from federal leadership on this issue to ensure injurious species are restricted in a timely way before they become firmly established. Similar injurious status will be an important companion protection to Florida state rules appropriately govern the federal realms of import and interstate commerce. Were you familiar with that?
Yes, sir.
And so it's and the only reason I'm raising this, first of all, I sympathize with you. I understand. I've ran a business. I understand you're concerned about the welfare of your wife and your family. But I want to make sure that we understand there's another side to this. There are other people that are from your area who have an opposing view, and they're very adamant. Ms. Lee-Valley, according to your testimony, you have concerns about the USDA's proposed rule to increase competition in the meatpacking market, and you testified before the USDA in a public panel, did you not?
I did.
An essential component of a fair and working regulatory process is that those who are impacted by a proposed rule have an opportunity to explain their concerns to the rulemaking body. That is the notice and comment period. You both had an opportunity to voice your concerns, and neither of the two rules you addressed is final. They are both still in the midst of the rulemaking process. And I want to direct your attention to a letter which I asked be admitted into record dated September 13, 2011, addressed to the Chairman. And it is from about 15 organizations, including the Campaign for Contract Agricultural Reform. I asked it to be admitted into the record.
Without objection.
Let me just read from this letter so that again, these are people who are not here. I want to make sure that their voices are heard, and they refer to 191 others who have the same opinion. It says, in conclusion, we urge Congress to allow USDA to move forward expeditiously to implement a final rule that will strengthen and clarify the Packers and Stockyard Acts with common sense protections for farmers and ranchers. We urge you to stand with our nation's farmers, ranchers, growers, and consumers to oppose the efforts of meat packer and poultry special interests to insulate themselves from federal scrutiny of their anti-competitive behavior and unfair treatment of farmers and ranchers. As a measure of support for the issuance of a GIPSA rule, listen to this. We have attached to our letter, an August 3rd, 2011 letter from 190 groups submitted to the Senate in support of finalizing the GIPSA proposed rule. These groups represent thousands of farmers, ranchers, and consumers from around the nation. Again, I just want to make sure that there's another voice here. There's some other folks that have a different view than what you have. Mr. Arkhurst, the title of today's hearing is How a Broken Process Leads to Flawed Regulations. One of the things that I'm concerned about, and you heard me say this in my opening statement, I've not heard too much here this morning so far that even if you get rid of the rules, that creates jobs. So do you hollow out a system, take away the regulations, take away the protections, businesses make more money, poverty goes up, income goes down for employees, regulations out of the window, and what's the guarantee that we get jobs? And if we don't know what either of these two final rules, by the way, this is my question real quick, if we don't know what either of these two final rules will look like, can we responsibly conclude that the process is broken or the regulations are flawed? Mr. Arkhurst.
You're correct. There is no evidence, empirical evidence, that deregulation or a lack of regulation creates jobs. And to the contrary, there is some evidence that regulations can create jobs, and there's overwhelming evidence, particularly from the financial crisis, that's the big example that jumps out, that a lack of regulation can be devastating to the economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. It is vitally important. I appreciate all of you who have traveled here to be here and to testify. Mr. Palmer, I'd like to direct my questions to you, and I just want to make sure I have this right. You had Northwest and Delta, great airlines, merging together, a move that was widely applauded as necessary in strengthening the airline industry and bringing together two great organizations. That happened in October of 2008. In September of 2009, the AFL-CIO, in this letter that I have here, that I'd ask unanimous consent to insert into the record, I'm sure that will be okay with the Chairman if we insert this into the record.
I'm sorry, without objection.
Thank you. The AFL-CIO sent a letter to the National Mediation Board suggesting a rule change that after 75 years of precedent, that they wanted to have these rules changed. And my understanding is that now 3 years into this merger, there still has not been a resolution.
There is not.
So here you have a very large industry, roughly $731 billion into our economy, transporting 50,000 tons a day in cargo, nearly 2 million people per day. There's this assertion that, well, maybe this doesn't have an effect. As the chairman was saying, as the ranking member was saying, well, you know, it doesn't have any effect. It does have an effect. My understanding is here, according to a CNN article, said, quote, on average, non-unionized Delta flight attendants take home 12% more than their non-unionized Northwest counterparts based on a typical 75-hour-a-month schedule. They enjoy more generous profit sharing and retirement matches from the company, and they don't have to dole out $43 a month to union dues. Now, Mr. Palmer, you don't strike me as an overtly politically engaged person who's just here with, you know, partisan lenses on to extol the Republican. I mean, my sense of it is that you're just looking at this objectively, and that you want to say to your colleagues and to this body, to the Congress as a whole, we want a resolution to this. Am I overstating that, or is that?
You're not. I respectfully disagree with Mr. Cumming that it doesn't affect us. I will bring it down from the numbers that you talked about. There's approximately 21,000 Delta flight attendants, and it affects every one of us every day. When you get on a Delta flight, you're going to get great service, but you're going to get great service from a Northwest crew or a Delta crew. Although our company is merged, we're not. So the CNN poll I'm not familiar with, but I do know that on every level, Delta flight attendants are paid more per hour according to seniority. Our per diem and other rates are higher. So we're doing the same job, we're going to the same destinations, but because we're in laboratory conditions and because the NMB and the AFA are still messing around with our careers, Delta is not able to merge us fully, so there are at least 7,000, perhaps 8,000 of the pre-merger Northwest. This affects every day.
And what does that do to the morale and the atmosphere and the working conditions? When you're right next to somebody who's exactly the same, and let's pretend they're exactly the same in every way, what does that do to the working conditions there?
The morale is certainly an issue because, first of all, I said in my testimony earlier, I began at Delta in 2008. I was in training when that vote happened, so according to the rules, I wasn't able to vote in it. So practically my whole career, I've been in laboratory conditions. There are people who have served through other mergers. Some of the other mergers were probably a little more smooth than this one, but this one is, Delta's telling us they're ready to move forward. The AFA is saying, no, we're not going anywhere. Probably the best way I can describe it is non-Delta flight attendants have no voice in this. We can't say we're ready to vote. We can't petition the NMB to vote because we're not a union, don't want a union. Those at Northwest who were unionized, even though they lost their union last year because they cast their votes not to have it, they don't even have a voice anymore, nor do they have a union. So it's politics and bureaucracy and red tape, and there's absolutely no stability right now with us.
But my understanding is that you said, I believe, 94% of the people did participate in the last election?
Not only was it 94%, but it was 94% under the new rules, which were actually more favorable to the union.
And what was the result of that vote, with 94% voting?
I believe 9,500 out of us voted, 9,544 or so, but the AFA immediately filed interference charges with Delta, or not with Delta, with the NMB, perceiving that too many people voted so that their polls were off. They thought they were going to win, but because too many people voted, they were wrong, and thus there was interference.
Did you experience any interference?
Absolutely not.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time is up. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Palmer, you are aware that when we have elections for governor or for president or for members of Congress, that the people that stay home and don't vote do not have their votes counted as a no. Is that right?
I'm aware of that, yes.
Okay. And that rule that was changed, in effect, just said that basically when you have a vote in a union situation in your industry, they're not going to count the people that stay home as a no vote anymore, right?
Correct.
Okay. Does that seem unreasonable to you?
It doesn't seem unreasonable to me.
Now, I've seen a motion in a lawsuit against the National Mediation Board that lists Matthew R. Palmer as one of the named parties listed as interveners in the suit. Is that, Mr. Palmer, the same person as you are?
I am.
Okay. And you intervened against the lawsuit against the National Mediation Board?
I did.
Would the gentleman yield for just a question?
Yes.
In my opening statement, pursuant to the ranking member's statement, we suggested strongly that we would not ask and have him answer related to the lawsuit because it's something that we would like to avoid this committee getting in the middle of. And I would ask the gentleman to try to agree with the ranking member.
If you really wanted to stay out of the middle of it, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Palmer wouldn't be sitting there, all right? So I'll make sure that we ask the questions and they don't skirt the lawsuit stuff, but let's be serious about this and not try to put him on there and then claim he can't ask him questions. All right? He's here for a purpose, and let's discuss it. Now, as I understand it, the plaintiff's lawsuit alleged that 2 members of the National Mediation Board approached the rulemaking with an unalterably closed minds. You echoed that claim in your testimony here today, while you write that all signs indicate that the world's largest flight attendant union, the AFA, was in backdoor dealings with board members Linda Petula and Harry Hoaglander. But the district court judge ruled against you and the other plaintiffs. He stated that the National Mediation Board had provided a neutral and rational basis for adopting the rule, and the judge determined that your allegations were insufficient to support even discovery in the issue. You didn't get in the door with it. The judge thought it was so weak. So the litigation is going on right now, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The plaintiffs have filed an appeal to the judge's ruling, and you're currently scheduled for oral arguments before the D.C. Circuit Court on Monday. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, I'm surprised in that situation to see Mr. Palmer here at the hearing if you truly want to stay out of the litigation. It seems to me that you're doing just the opposite there, Mr. Chairman. You've been sensitive to this issue before. You were sensitive to it in the Tillman case. You were sensitive to it in the Blackwater employees case on that. And if you really wanted to be sensitive to it here today, Mr. Palmer would be sitting out in the audience and not at the witness table. Mr. Palmer, do you have concerns that your participation in this hearing might imply in some way that this committee is trying to support you in your ongoing litigation against the National Mediation Board?
No, I would like to respond to your first question as well.
Well,
but
I also, since I have limited time to ask the questions, I'm going to ask him and ask you to answer my questions.
I understand that. No,
I want to examine your claim that your testimony that the new rules regarding union elections are tilted in favor of unions. We haven't seen any evidence that unions have won any more union elections after the implementation of these new rules. According to the data that the National Mediation Board in this fiscal year, 2011, provided, following the enactment of the rule change, the National Mediation Board has overseen 31 elections, and the certification rate for the elections under the new rule was basically the same as it had been for the decade prior, raising by exactly 1 percentage point, from 61.5% to 62.5%. These elections under the new rules included 4 elections involving Delta personnel. The unions lost all 4 of the Delta elections under the new election proceedings. All right, Mr. Chairman, I just want to wind up my comments saying, like, if Mr. Palmer wasn't supposed to be having this committee look like it was coming down on the side of the plaintiffs in that case, he shouldn't be sitting here. They clearly have lost 4 elections under the new rules. They have not been adversely impacted on that. Mr. Palmer has a direct interest as a plaintiff in that matter. And I think that we in this committee should be in the business of not interfering with litigation. We should not be putting these matters on here when they are going on, and it would have been entirely appropriate to leave Mr. Palmer on the bench.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
I know we are going to disagree until the end of this hearing. Our view was that job creators and people impacted were coming here to give their opinions about either rules, proposed rules, or other things that they thought was impacting them. We asked Mr. Palmer, and he did so in his opening statement, to limit to his opinion about the effect. Now, I know you're a baseball fan, so I understand that if they change the size of the strike box, it may or may not affect differences, but at least as to the pitchers, they would say their job got easier or harder with a rule change. Mr. Palmer is expressing an opinion about that.
Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time. You can't convince me that all of the employees, there was 21,000 employees, Mr. Palmer was the only person that could testify with that point of view, and that was necessary to bring a plaintiff in a lawsuit here to testify with 20,999 others available to be the person to sit on that panel.
My staff, for the record, my staff indicates that at the time of his invitation, we were not aware he was an intervener, but when we became aware, we chose to go forward, and I appreciate the gentleman's concern. With that, we go to the gentleman who represents my alma mater, Mr. Walberg.
And always proud to represent Siena Heights University. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Palmer, I appreciate you being here, and I want to give you an opportunity to answer a question that you did want to answer. All I would say is I appreciate the efforts of Delta and Northwest attendants and crew. You complete every week, at least twice, the object of my grandchildren, and that's to have a safely returned grandfather, because they are the only people in the world that truly adore me. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to ask 5 questions, at least that's my intention, and so if you could keep your answers as brief as possible, but complete as possible. I want to let you end by answering the basic question, any additional points or comments you'd like to address. But let me go back. My Democrat colleagues state that the old rules were undemocratic, and the elections were not how we elect government officials. How do you respond to that?
He was partly right. They are democratic, but they are not like we elect you, and they are not like we elect you for several reasons. If you underperform, then your constituents have a right to vote you out in a period of time. Also, your constituents do not pay you dues. You, as I've written in my testimony as well, besides that, I'll go here, the NLRB, which the NRLA and the NMB wanted to do, there was an equal process to decertify. Once you vote in a union, say Delta or Northwest with AFA, it's for an indefinite term. There's no equal process to go back. There's the convoluted straw man poll that I talked about. You have to get one person out of the 21,000 to be a straw man. We all have to identically sign cards. It has to be 50% of us plus one within a year. then hold the election, and then hope that the person that we are electing to replace the union will actually then step down once and if somehow he wins.
So you're captured?
Yes, absolutely. Completely different.
Assertions have been made that Delta interfered in the election. Did you experience any interference from the company in any way?
I did not.
Is there any way for Delta to know how a flight attendant voted in the election?
There's not. I also had ballot point. We vote online and by phone, which is another difference. We vote for 5 weeks. We don't vote for 12 hours on one day. You have 5 weeks to vote. You can vote online or you can vote by phone. That allegation came up from AFA. I contacted Ballot Point, who coincidentally is who AFA uses for their internal elections at Northwest. They state that they give us a PIN, random PIN, and a random password. They store those on 2 separate servers, so once you log in and then place your PIN, I have an email from them stating that not even their engineers could tell you how you voted, and even if they did tell you how you voted, they have no clue who that PIN belonged to. So no.
So no ballot identification of the voter in any way, shape, or form?
No way, shape, or form.
You mentioned that the old rules were consistent with the Railway Labor Act. Can you explain?
I can. The old rule was, it was 50% plus 1 of the majority of the class. So with just a round number, 20,000 flight attendants at Delta, if 10,001 voted, then you would be unionized. They've changed that now to be a minority vote. So if 2,000 vote and 1,001 vote in the affirmative for any union, not even just AFA, now you have a union for the whole group. So it was completely different.
Okay. Has the NMB ever been requested to change the rules before?
Yes, they have. Actually, they've been 4 times, and probably the most interesting time was under the Carter administration. They had the exact same board. It's a 3-member board. It was 1 Republican, 2 Democrats. They were, I believe, in the mid-'80s and the late '70s also asked, and then this last time with the TTD. During the Carter administration, the NMB actually published in their register that they did not believe that they had the right, that it could only go by congressional law. And again, I reiterate, we have two Democrats and 1 Republican now. During the Carter administration, it was the same thing. They refused to change it then. It was refused to be changed in the '60s and refused to be changed in the '80s.
In 27 seconds, any additional comments or points you'd like to make on this issue that you seem extremely passionate about and is very personal?
Well, I think that someone mentioned earlier about that Americans have the right to know the inherent costs to us with regulations. There's $516 of dues each year, plus millions over the course of the year for the unions. We have a right to have that money and know what it's going to be used for. With unions, we do not.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's very easy in a hearing like this to beat up on the executive branch for different problems with regulations. I think Congress needs to remember where the laws come from, and that's us. And oftentimes we fail in our responsibilities to pass good laws. So that really makes it harder on the agencies to pass or formulate good regulations. An example I wanted to bring up in particular is the Lacey Act, and I'd like to ask the Chairman to amend the report that he's already submitted for the record, because on page 13 of his document it says the Lacey Act was last amended in 1981. Well, we amended it in 2008. We added plant species to that act. And a Tennessee company recently has suffered greatly as a result of overzealous enforcement of that act. The law as written by Congress included no grandfathering whatsoever. So it literally puts at risk every serious musician in the United States, not just musical instruments, but flooring, all sorts of industries that have to do with wood products or paper products, things like that. And that was a congressional mistake. I didn't vote for this law. The President actually vetoed it, and Congress went to the trouble of overriding the veto. Now, this law was a very small part of a much larger farm bill, but that shows the risk that we take when we pass a massive piece of legislation, and it's hard to spot the individual components of it. Another flaw with the laws passed by Congress is it puts our legal fate in this country completely in the hands of foreign lawmakers and the way they come up with their laws, which is sometimes hard to detect in one of the, 220 countries around the world. So the best way to reform is to start looking in the mirror. And we have a lot of work to do here. It used to be, years ago, that there were study groups in Congress so that we could actually have a better idea of knowing what we were voting on in advance before the vote. An earlier speaker, Newt Gingrich, banned those organizations, and that ban has continued now for a decade or two. So now each one of us has individual staffs that try to keep up with what we're voting on, but it's very difficult for them to do a super professional job the way it used to be done. So perhaps this Congress could look into reinstating those organizations, allowing them to form so we could have a much more professional look. The group that I particularly focused on in the past was called the Democratic Study Group, but actually Republicans trusted it so much they subscribed too, because this group did not assume that you would vote with the Democratic Party at all. They just wanted to serve up the facts, give you the pro and con, and then let you make up your mind according to what's in the best interest of your country and your folks back home. That sounds a little old-fashioned, but wouldn't that be nice to return to ideas like that so we'd actually have a much more solid idea of what we're voting on? So there is a silver lining in this hearing. I think a couple of the witnesses and most folks on this committee realize that Cass Sunstein is a brilliant individual. I wish he had more clout and more visibility. We're going to hear from him in a little bit. But I think he wants to make good things happen to get these cost-benefit analyses right. But it's difficult to reform a process overnight. So hopefully with a little goodwill, a little patience, we can start fixing some of these broken things that have been broken for a long time in this town. And I think Congress should start with itself. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be delighted.
First of all, we take note of the 2008 Act and would ask unanimous consent we be able to revise the document before submission. Secondly, I appreciate your points, including the unintended consequences to the guitar industry and a number of others. This committee is cognizant that we have to do review of laws we have passed, and I hope that we continue to remember that many of the regulations that get created do start with ill-prepared legislation. And I will take to note, along with the ranking member, if we can address your concerns on the study committees, because I think there's successor study committees, but I'd like to know more about what you'd like to see, and we'll work on that. Thank you, gentlemen. We now go to the other gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for appearing here today. Mr. Arkush, as I listened to your testimony, it reminded me of a reality TV show that was on, I think, Ashton Kutcher, where you've been punked. And before I spend time asking you questions, I want to make sure you weren't punking us today with that testimony. Okay. Why do you think so many of our companies are going overseas to create their businesses?
Oh, well, I'm certainly not a multinational corporation myself, so I don't have a lot of personal insight into that. I think a lot of factors go into decisions like that.
Okay. Have you ever worked for the Office of Management and Budget?
No, I haven't.
Office of Information Regulatory Affairs?
No, I haven't.
Have you ever headed an executive or independent agency?
No, I have not.
Owned or operated your own small business?
That's a close call.
Okay.
Yeah.
As part of the Job Creators Tour, I've traveled through Tennessee and visited 30-plus factories and businesses and asked them what was standing in the way to job creation, and their opinion is a little different than yours. Probably the number one answer I get is that we need to get government out of the way, and EPA comes up quite often, and so clearly their opinion of regulations differs from yours. Do you think that all regulations are good?
Oh, no, of course not. Anyone can make mistakes, and that's true of the government as well. And on the note of what small businesses think, there have been some interesting surveys recently that have shown that the number one concern of small businesses is poor sales. The concern is there won't be enough demand for their products. It's not government regulation.
Okay. Just to get this straight, I think you had said that one of the biggest problems for regulatory agencies is that they're over-regulated.
That's right.
Okay. I want to make sure I heard that correctly. Doesn't that in itself suggest that the bureaucrats here in Washington are doing a poor job in terms of over-regulating?
It suggests to me the contrary. It's that even when there's a common sense rule that they want to write, that everyone agrees on. Sometimes industry wants rules. Sometimes industry and labor get together and they say to an agency, we need a new rule here. Even in those instances, it's too hard and it takes too long to write a simple, non-controversial rule because there are so many administrative burdens on these agencies.
I hear a lot of numbers thrown around out there, what regulations cost employers. I've heard anywhere from $9,000 to $12,000 per employee just through the sheer number of regulations. Is that a number that sounds about right?
No, it sounds wrong to me.
Okay. What, do you have a number?
Well, I think that number is derived from this study that by these economists Crane and Crane, that they said that regulations cost the economy $1.75 trillion a year. That study has been thoroughly discredited. It had an incomplete data set. It had a flawed methodology. It only looked at costs of regulations. It didn't look at benefits. If we looked at everything that way, we wouldn't buy food. I would say, well, my grocery bill is a little high. That's $50 a week. That's a big cost.
Well, I don't disagree. Some regulations are good. I'm not trying to sound like I'm anti-regulation. But what I'm hearing in the real world from real job creators is that we need to get government out of their way, and they are overburdened. So I appreciate your testimony and being a good sport with.
I have one real world. I do have one real world personal response to some of this. And the Lacey Act concerns. Okay. I actually am the way in which I have a small business is I'm a musician, and I actually work in a band that we play weddings and bar mitzvahs. If you have anyone, you have it. And I'm
excuse me, but no soliciting here.
I'm sorry.
If we let it start with you, you'll end up with Pepsi cans sitting on the.
With all respect, that was a joke. But I'm a guitarist, and I don't have concerns about the Lacey Act. It's not a problem for me. It's not a problem for my business.
I wanted to get to Mrs. LaValle for a moment because clearly you've got a great story there. In your testimony, you indicated that the USDA previously promoted consumer-driven small-scale processing operations. Can you expand on how the new rule now restricts your operation?
Certainly, when we go back to the proposed rule, what it says in the proposed language is that it bans packer-to-packer sales, does not differentiate size or anything, nor do I believe that differentiating size is an answer by any means. However, what it says is 2/3 of our animals actually are sold directly to a packer. Under this proposed regulation, it says that those packer-to-packer sales are banned. We are a packer. I am a packer. I am a producer. I'm a feeder. I'm a rancher. And because I am a packer, I now have limitations on who I can actually sell to because I cannot sell the rest of my animals to another packer.
Okay. The Chairman's been quick with the gavel, but I just want to real quickly, if I get my question, maybe he'll let you answer. Is it true that JIPS agreed to conduct a more rigorous cost-benefit analysis of the rule in response to the stakeholders' concerns? It
is true, and we appreciate that. However, what we would like is that there be that be open for review and comment. We know that the original economic analysis was flawed. And so, again, just as you all have said, 147 of you have written a letter saying that this process should be open for public comment. We want that to be the case. And we've heard that that won't be the case as far as being open for public comment. That review, that cost-benefit analysis should be open for review and public comment.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Mrs. LaValle. I yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman and the gentlelady. We now go to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me my opening statement. I appreciate it. Mr. Barker, I listened to your testimony, and I have some questions about it, but let me ask, you make reference to the Lacey Act. Am I not correct that the Lacey Act was introduced in 1900 by a Republican congressman from Iowa and signed into law by a Republican President, William McKinley, to try to, well, its original motivation was to try to protect endangered species that were being more than decimated because of the, feather trade in women's hats at the time. Is that not correct?
I'm no expert on the history of the Lacey Act. I can't respond, sir.
Well, that act that's been on the books for 111 years, in your view, does it represent burdensome regulation that should be repealed?
Yes, at least in some cases, sir. It's a huge act.
Thank you. You made reference to the USGS study, and I think you said it was very unscientific. This is the study you're referring to?
Yes, 302 pages, published in 2009.
Are you aware of the fact that a number of scientists from all over the United States signed a letter praising this study and saying it most certainly is scientific and is relevant and ought to be taken cognizance of as we perform our deliberations? I'm referring to a letter you may not have seen, be glad to share with you, to my colleague from Virginia, Bobby Scott, who was then the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security on January 20th of last year. This letter is signed by PhDs, usually in botany or biology or natural sciences, from Waldorf College, University of Hawaii, University of Tennessee, Florida Museum of Natural History, University of Massachusetts, Texas Tech, Duke University, Central Lakes College, Welder Wildlife Federation, Defenders of Wildlife, Bishop Museum in Hawaii, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Auburn University. Have you seen that letter from these scientists?
I don't have it with me here, but yes, I have seen the letter. Most of these signatories on it are people who would be identified professionally as invasion species biologists and colleagues of the authors of that paper.
So they're just biased?
Some are graduate students of one of the authors.
Are you familiar with the testimony given in March of last year by the Director of the National Park Service before the House Resources Committee? And he said, and I quote, "The Burmese python is currently well established in South Florida, including Everglades National Park and Big Cypress National Preserve, and a population of boa constrictors is established south of Miami. Additionally, recent evidence strongly suggests a reproducing population of northern African pythons on the western boundaries of Miami." He's testifying here that these invasive species, these non-native exotic species, have now in fact established themselves in South Florida. Do you take any issue with that testimony?
There are several issues. One is that the Everglades region of South Florida has more established alien species than any other similar ecosystem in the world. Fully one-third of all plants and animals that have ever been recorded in that area are established alien species.
Do you believe that the Federal Government has any obligation whatsoever, in concert with the State Government of Florida, to try to hold back and, if not actually try to improve progress in curbing both the introduction of exotic foreign species that could be dangerous to the habitat, and to try to make some progress in curbing the habitat of the Burmese python and other reptiles?
I don't know of anyone who's happy about Burmese pythons existing in the Everglades region of South Florida. It is a problem, but it is a very localized state problem. It is not a federal problem. It's not, Burmese pythons are not going to spread across the United States and strike fear in the hearts of kindergartners everywhere. So in this case, I think the Lacey Act is just simply the wrong piece of legislation to invoke. And I can offer as an example of the fact that they're not going to, I disagree with some conclusions in that report and other people support it, but in terms of actual evidence, over the past 20 years, a significantly larger number of Burmese pythons were imported into Los Angeles, and there's no established population of the snakes there. They've been maintained in large numbers by tens of thousands of people across the southern United States for 30 and 40 years. I got my first one 41 years ago. I don't have any now, there are no other populations anywhere else in the United States, and I think that Florida has acted very aggressively and very appropriately to handle the problem at the state level. They've done very well. And I will mention that the African rock python that was included in the testimony last year is believed to have been extirpated from the United States now. There were a very small number of animals existing in a huge pile of lumber. The state came in, wood chipped the whole thing, didn't find any more animals wiped out the thing. No animals have been reported in 12 months, and they are waiting another year to formally declare them as exterminated, but they appear to be gone.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, who is not going to ask questions at this time. We now go to the gentleman from Texas. Oh, no, Mr. Gowdy's out. You sure? We go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And being a Texan, a big cattle growing state, I wanted to talk to Ms. LaValle for a second about the effort that goes into producing cattle. You know, the USDA right now, you know, they grade select, choice, and prime, and that affects how much you get for your cattle. And can you tell us a little bit about increasing upon that and creating different markets with specialized product, you know, grass-fed, Angus? I mean, there's some effort that goes into doing that, and the breeds and how that. Can you just give me like a 30, 45-second background there?
Sure, and I appreciate the question. 62%, when we look at all of the marketing arrangements in the United States that are incurred by beef cattle producers, are these added value. And the added value is because of the way they are raised, or the way they are processed, or the quality, meaning that they are either higher quality, closer to grading choice or prime, or that they are meeting a consumer demand. Because they are very specific in how they are raised, the processors and packers have rewarded that individual or that ranch by paying a higher premium price because it's closer to what the consumer wants. And so again, that price differentiation between that and just a straight animal that's not added any value, there is that price differentiation because of the added value, the added cost, and the added benefit, and the consumer has been the one to benefit with the higher quality and greater eating experience.
Right, so y'all spend some effort to, you'll get more money if you sell it to a gourmet restaurant as opposed to a fast food restaurant, is a simple way to put that.
Correct.
All right, so under the GIPSA regulations, tell me what's going to happen to that sort of business model.
Again, when you see the vagueness of the language that you see in the proposed regulation and the potential for increase in litigation, what you have is the opportunity to actually reduce the quality contracts, to reduce the ability to capture that market value, to actually get paid for the added benefit. And again, the increased litigation will have the USDA with the oversight of, is this price fair? The USDA will be determining what price is fair, not looking at the differences in the quality of animals or the weight differences or the freight differences or anything like that. USDA will be providing that oversight. That oversight will actually increase the uncertainty in the market, and when we have increased uncertainty in the market, we have the tendency to go to the lowest common denominator price, which means there will be a rollback in the prices received for the beef cattle industry, because there will be not anyone that wants to take the chance because of that increased government intervention and increased potential for litigation.
I can't imagine any industry that would be happy with the government telling them how and what factors have to be taken into setting their price. That kind of strikes me as going against the fundamental principles that this country was founded on. Now, I take it you're not opposed to all USDA regulations. I mean, they need to be in there making sure the packing plants are safe and, you know, their traditional grading methods, maybe even some additional grading methods. Would that be a fair statement?
That would be a fair statement. Every day there is between 2 and 3 USDA inspectors in our packing plant every day, and we welcome them. We work with them on all of our plans.
All right. I appreciate it very much. Is there anything you wanted to add about I mean, are you able to partner well with the USDA? I mean, you work well with them on most things. Is that not correct?
We do. We actually do. And again, we welcome that partnership in our plant. We just do not feel that they need to be in the pricing business or the setting of pricing business or have the potential for increased litigation and competition. I would like to just go back to the letter that was referenced that was entered into the record. I want there to be well known that the majority of the groups that signed on to that letter that were in support of the GIPSA regulation were non-producer groups and do not represent the majority of the livestock in the country. So I do want that reflected, that even though there was significant numbers, we have 84 producer groups that represent the majority of the livestock that is produced in this country that are opposed to this regulation.
And who benefits from, I mean, what's the good outcome? Who benefits from this regulation? To me, it just seems anti-competitive.
When you look at this, and when we look at that there is not a clear cost-benefit analysis completed, it will not be the individual that is out there every day producing the livestock. They will not benefit in any way because, again, the price will be rolled back because no one will want to pay a premium for fear of litigation. So no one, whether it's small, medium, or large, no one benefits from having this increased intervention in government litigation.
Do you see a consumer benefit? To me, it seems like it would take away choices. You know, your ability to say, all right, I'm going to do organic beef, or I'm just going to raise Angus cattle, or I'm going to just do grass-fed cattle. To me, do you think there's a benefit to consumers there at all?
No, we see a rollback with the consumer choices also in the outcome of this. It's unintended consequences with this GIPSA regulation.
All right, thank you very much, and I'll yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If I may say before I ask my question, we are having these regulations. Just as the country is recovering from an economic debacle that everyone agrees did not come from the usual market forces, but from the failure to regulate. It produced a whole set of regulations, Dodd-Frank, and by the way, we were saved from a worse debacle because of regulations that were enacted 75 years ago during the 1930s. Now, I'd like to ask a question about cost-benefit. We know we've had cost-benefit analysis for a very long time. But Mr. Graham makes a very serious charge that there may be, quote, serious and systematic flaw in the benefit and cost numbers, and even suggests that the regulatory agencies have their thumb on the scales. Now, I went and asked somebody to bring me the regulations themselves, the regulation at issue itself, Executive Order 13563. It says, in applying these principles, each agency is directed to use the best available techniques to quantify anticipated present and future benefits and costs as accurately as possible. I'd like to ask Mr. Akrosh, are you aware of any basis for this very serious charge, essentially that the agencies are cheating in doing the cost-benefit analysis?
Yes and no, but perhaps not in the way that Mr. Graham means it. The agencies might try to cheat, might try to put a thumb on the scale one way or the other. In my view, in the view of my organization, when Mr. Graham was heading OIRA, the Bush administration and OIRA were putting a thumb on the scale against measuring benefits adequately. Now his view, when he is no longer in the government, is that the Obama administration is putting a thumb on the scale the other way. There are 2 points here. One is that this just demonstrates how flawed cost-benefit analysis is as a methodology. It is very difficult to measure the costs and the benefits of a lot of very important things in the regulatory process. The value of lives saved, the value of health, the value of clean air, clean water, children's IQ points, and people can disagree intensely on how to measure those things. One of Dr. Graham's disagreements with the Obama cost-benefit analysis on fuel economy standards is that he thinks he knows better what the price of gasoline is going to be in 10 or 20 years than the Obama administration does. If he knew that, if any of us could know that, we would be far richer than any of us is. These are serious, difficult problems that can't be resolved easily. There are political differences over those problems, and what Graham's testimony shows is when he was in charge of OIRA, he knew how to use his institutional power to require agencies to conform to his views. It doesn't mean that his views are right. It doesn't mean that the Obama administration is wrong. The second point is it is very difficult for agencies to rig the cost-benefit analysis in the manner that Dr. Graham says. It is hard to overstate benefits, and because again, they tend to get understated in the economic analysis. They're hard to value.
Why do they tend to get understated?
Because it's so hard to put a price on them. So again, it's hard to value the cost, the benefit of saving a life. At the same time, costs frequently are overstated because most of the information that agencies get is from industry. Industry has every incentive to overinflate cost estimates, and we're only looking at the world as it exists today when we look at costs of regulatory compliance. We have no way of factoring in how much compliance costs diminish with new innovations, new efficiencies. Retrospective reviews tend to show that the cost estimates for major regulations were vastly overstated when we look back at them later.
Yeah, I found another section of the executive order that welcomes flexible approaches where relevant and feasible, consistent with regulatory objectives. It says the agency shall identify and consider regulatory approaches that reduce burdens and maintain the flexibility and freedom of choice of the public. And then it gives examples, warnings, disclosure requirements, information to the public. That would seem to suggest that regulations are more flexible than has been alleged. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll give the time to Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Graham, the phrase cost-benefit analysis sounds impossible to disagree with, much like shared sacrifice and balanced approach and some other phrases we've heard recently. How could one possibly not agree with a cost-benefit analysis? So my question to you is, can that analysis be gamed or manipulated, and if so, how?
Yes, there are a lot of assumptions and inputs that go into a calculation of cost or benefit. And if you're trying to tell a good story about a regulation, you can try to pick the inputs that make the regulation look good. If you're trying to make the regulation look bad, you can try to pick some that makes them look bad. The key role that OIRA has in this process is to review these cost-benefit analysis and make sure that they're reasonably well done.
Mr. Arkush, do you agree with one famous law professor by the name of Cass Sunstein, who said, expensive regulations may well increase prices, reduce wages, and increase unemployment? You agree with him?
I'm still waiting for Mr. Sunstein to provide the evidence to substantiate that conclusion.
So you disagree with him? Well, let me go to his boss, President Obama. There are some rules and regulations that put an unnecessary burden on a business. Is the President right or wrong?
I don't doubt that we could imagine there might be some, but the President hasn't.
Can you name one? Because he said he could come up with 501 if you include his salmon example from the State of the Union.
That's right. And the conclusion among consumer groups like mine and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was that the administration didn't find that much. There just aren't that many overly burdensome, unnecessary regulations.
You can't think of a single solitary rule or regulation that is unnecessary or duplicative.
I didn't say I can't think of a single one.
Well, name one.
There are 500 examples that the President came up with. The President, for example, is going to reduce, they're going to make certain record keeping electronic rather than in paper. That's a great idea.
Is that the only one you can think of?
I didn't come here to speak about examples of overly burdensome regulations. When the administration went looking, they found 500 individual ones, but none of them is very significant. And that's what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce thinks, not just me.
If someone were to say we should have no more regulation than the health, safety, and security of the American people require, you agree with that or disagree with that as a standard of review for regulations and rules?
I think it's a reasonable formulation, but it's a little odd. I don't think that the question is, do we have too much regulation or too little? I think it's whether we have the right regulation.
Do you know who said that?
I believe that might have been the President of the United States.
It was, and let me ask you with respect to a couple of specific examples, can you tell me how the health, safety, and security of the American people are impacted by the NLRB's new quickie election rules?
I'm actually not an expert on those rules at all, but I do know that union membership in this country has declined a lot in the last several decades.
Historic low.
And that's, yes, and it's correlated with poor income distribution. It's correlated
So
with.
you agree that that rule is calculated solely to drive up union membership? That's what you just said.
Absolutely not.
That's what you just said.
I was responding. I was taking for granted. I thought that you were saying it was a pro-union rule, and I was taking that for granted in my answer.
But you agree that it was calculated solely to drive up union membership?
I have no idea. I'm not familiar with the rule.
Can you tell me how the posting of posters informing workers of their right to unionize but not their right to decertify a union impacts the health, safety, or security of the American public?
I believe that all Americans should have adequate knowledge about their rights.
Including their right to decertify if they're in a union?
They should have knowledge of any right that they have. I believe that unions work best when they're democratic. I believe that workplaces work best when they respect their workers and respect the choice to join unions if that's what workers want.
So you would disagree with and argue against an NLRB rule or regulation that only gave half of a worker's right, the right to unionize, but did not inform them of their right to decertify a union?
You know, in the abstract, I don't know much about these rules, but sure, sounds like they should know about their full rights.
All right, the redefining of bargaining units, can you tell me how that impacts the health, safety, or security of the American public?
I don't even know what you mean by the redefining of bargaining units.
Reconstituting who can vote in union elections and the majority necessary to win. How does that impact the health, safety, or security of the American public?
I would guess that, again, I don't know, I'm not familiar with these rules, but I would guess that whoever put them in place has a pretty well thought out theory on how it helps.
Could it be raising membership in unions? Could that be the well thought out goal?
That might be, and that would actually be a laudable goal if it were.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I now recognize the gentleman from New Hampshire. Okay. I will take some of this time. First, Mr. Gowdy, do you have any other questions? Do you need some additional time?
Mr. Chairman, I think I have exhausted my questions, but thank you for your gracious offer.
All right. Dr. Graham, would you like to respond to Mr. Arkush? He said that he took some issue with some of the things that you were saying in your testimony. I don't know if you took note of those things. If you would take the time to respond to him.
Yes, just two factual things for the record. One of his comments was that agencies don't know how to take into account the fact that the costs of regulations sometimes decline over time as industry gets accustomed to them and learns how to comply. But in fact, some of the agencies like EPA build in assumed reductions in costs over time, for example, in compliance with motor vehicle standards. And there are other cases where regulations end up being more costly than anticipated. And of course, that needs to be part of the understanding as well. The second thing was my key point on the future of oil prices and gasoline prices is certainly not that I know the future of those prices. I would be a very wealthy person if I could know that much. My point is the agency in good faith analysis needs to consider the possibility that they might actually stabilize and decline over time as that they will continue to rise in the future. And that's due to the slowing of the growth of the Chinese and Indian economy and the growing supplies around the world as new discoveries of oil and new technologies to find them are invented. So we just need to take into account both of those possibilities.
Okay. Now, as you know, and as was already mentioned, last week the President told a joint session of Congress that we should have no more regulation than the health, safety, and security of the American people require. Every rule should meet that common sense test. Do you believe Federal regulatory agencies are currently meeting this common sense test?
I think it's a rule-by-rule analysis, and I cited one concrete example. Giving special compliance credits for electric cars under the mileage program, it doesn't improve the environment, it doesn't make us any safer, it just allows manufacturers to produce more cars that have lower mileage to offset those. So counting them as zero pollution when in fact pollution occurs back at the power plant, it doesn't do anything for the health, safety, and the environment of the country.
Okay. How would you suggest that we solve this problem? How can we get to, do you have any specific reforms that you could suggest?
Well, I'd like to just start with encouraging the members of this committee to look very carefully at the operation of OIRA, of the amount of activity OIRA is engaged in to improve these analyses. And there are two concrete ways you can do that. One, you can ask OIRA to provide examples of cost-benefit analyses that were changed because of the reviews that OIRA has done and how they've been improved. Because after these rules are done, those public documents should be available. There's nothing deliberative about that. And second of all, you should be asking for examples of regulations that were withdrawn or returned or whatever because of poor quality cost-benefit analysis. I can assure you, after working 6 years in the administration and working on these, it's very hard for these couple dozen people in OIRA to keep track of all of these regulations and analyses, and the number of them that are costly is on the rise. It's a very important job that OIRA plays at this time in our American economy.
Okay, thank you. Now, the President and his administration keep saying that they have had less regulatory burden than other past administrations. Do you agree with that?
I haven't seen the basis for that claim, no.
Now, you spoke about midnight regulations in your testimony. Can you explain to us what that is?
Well, at the end of presidential administrations, at the end of the 4th year or the 8th year, there's a historic pattern that presidents and their regulators, they like to get out as many of the rules as they can right at the end of the administration. So you see in Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, that last 6-month period tends to be a place where a lot of these rules are issued.
Now, has the Obama administration been using that? Because we're not at the end, yet of his administration.
No, and I would be very surprised if this administration is any different than the previous ones. And that's another example of a time when a strong and vigorous OIRA is very important.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield now to the gentlelady from New York.
Well, I thank the gentleman for having this important hearing and for all of your testimony. We are in several different hearings at once. I regret I was not here, but I did read it. And in terms of regulation, with the financial crisis, it's really the first financial crisis, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that was caused by the financial industry, basically unregulated aspects of the financial industry. And we saw through this crisis that areas that were regulated did not cause the problem. It was unregulated areas of credit default swaps and innovative new products that had no regulation in the past. And in fact, I'll never forget President Obama, when he came to Wall Street and unveiled his regulatory proposal, he quoted from the paper and he said, many people on Wall Street are upset that these regulations are going to destroy their productivity. And he reads this long statement from the paper, and then he says this is in 1929, 1930, after they created the FDIC, which by all respects performed extremely well to stabilize our markets, protect consumers' deposits, and move forward. So I would say that the FDIC was a regulation that helped save our economy in many ways, and their ability to wind down companies or to manage them in a way that kept the stability of the financial markets was a plus. For the unregulated areas, Congress had two choices. You could either bail them out, which is a bad choice, or you could close them down, an equally bad choice. The FDIC, with the regulatory tools that they were given, and in which Dodd-Frank expanded to include the coverage of other areas that were unregulated, you're able to manage it in a way that the shocks to the economy were less. And one of the most riveting testimonies during this time was by Christina Romer, who was the head of the Economic Committee of Advisors. She said the shocks to the American economy during this Great Recession were 3 times tougher and deeper and stronger than they were during the Great Depression. So in some cases, regulations can save industry, and can save our financial markets and can protect consumers. So I would just like to ask, are there any examples where you have seen regulation maybe improve the quality of life of Americans, the economic security of Americans? And I'd like to ask Mr. Arkush if you could testify. I know that you came out with a report recently in this area, and I found it a very interesting report, and I'd like a unanimous consent to put in the record the report that was done by a public citizen, if that would be appropriate.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. So can you give us some examples where regulation has actually been helpful in making our water cleaner, our air cleaner, our appliances work safer, or that your money that you deposit in a bank might actually be there and not be removed or lost, so that there's economic security for American families? Thank you.
Sure. There's obviously a vast number of regulations that protect our air, our water, the safety of our deposits in banks. The report that we issued yesterday was talking about regulations that not only did those types of things, but also spurred innovation in the industries that they applied to. So, for example, when the EPA decided to phase out CFCs and aerosol because CFCs were harmful to the ozone layer, industry protested, made the usual arguments about how this would kill millions of jobs, it would put an entire sector out of business. But when it finally came down to it, the day after EPA finalized its rule, the very next day, the inventor of the original aerosol announced that he'd come up with a solution. And it actually turned out it was not a problem to comply with this great regulation, which prevented the destruction of the ozone layer. Another example was when OSHA moved to phase out vinyl chloride, a harmful carcinogen, from the workplace. Manufacturers of PVC pipes said this would destroy their industry and cost lots of jobs. But within 3 months of the finalization of the rule, a company came up with a new manufacturing process for PVC pipe that was more efficient, allowed the companies to comply with the rule, and didn't require them to kill the manufacturing workers.
Well, my time has expired, but I think if we're going to discuss the impact of regulations on jobs, shouldn't we also include information about their economic and social benefits, including whether they actually may create new products, new jobs, or protect the American citizens and the American economy, as they've done in terms of the deposit system and other areas. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I will now yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back my time to the Chair.
Thank you. And I will take that time. Mr. Barker, how would the proposed rule banning the importation and interstate trade of snakes affect your business?
90% of my business is interstate, and a smaller percentage is international, and the Lacey Act stops that. The animals can't be crossed across state lines under any circumstances, and it's a felony to do so. So whether I sell them or my customer gets them and then whatever, they just can't be moved across state lines.
And does that affect any other businesses as well?
My industry is tightly interconnected with many, many other large and small businesses. My wife and I spend a lot of money at Home Depot. We spend a lot of money with Delta Air Cargo. We spend a lot of money with FedEx. We buy snake cages, and they in turn buy stainless steel, plastics, glass, whatever. We buy rats. The rat breeders invest in cages. The rat breeders buy food. They buy, the grain mills buy grain from, it's not, people who don't like snakes or don't know about snakes don't realize how widespread it is and how interconnected it is and how many people do it.
Thank you. I'm not a big fan of the snakes, but that's Dr. Graham. You just heard the gentlelady from New York talking about how we needed to also discuss the benefits of regulation, and I'm always confused when I hear that, because I think that is implicit in the term cost-benefit analysis. I mean, isn't that what we're asking? We're not asking to only look at the cost of regulation. We're asking to look at both. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and when I teach my students, I use the phrase benefit cost analysis because I tell them that B has the alphabetical advantage, and it's to reminding people that benefits are important as well as costs.
So you're not here to say that there are no benefits to regulation?
No, there are often quite substantial benefits.
Okay, so Mr. Arkush, I'm going to ask you a few questions. I looked at your impressive resume, and you have some great experience in academia. You went to some great law schools. How much experience have you had in the private sector?
Well, I've worked. I've had many jobs, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm actually in a
band.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We work. It's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. How many employees have you had in your life?
I've never had a full-time employee myself.
So how can you sit here with all these job makers and say that there is no cost to the regulatory burden that their jobs have?
Oh, I certainly never said there was no cost.
Okay, so you said that there's not a single regulation that you can think of that is bad. Is that correct?
Well, that's right. Not off the top of my head. And in fact, today I think we've only heard, all we've heard is repetition about 2 or 3 specific examples.
But we've had hundreds of hearings about regulations, and I think there's numerous regulations that are bad. But actually, your testimony today actually contradicts what you're saying. You tell us that it was the failure to regulate that created a lot of the problems, but then you said something that I actually agreed with, but I don't think you realized what you were saying. You said that there's not too much or too little regulation. Sometimes the problem is that we don't have the right regulation. Isn't that true?
Absolutely.
Well, if there's not too much or too little, it means that some of our regulations are actually not correct, not the ones taking care of the problem. So the problem is not that we don't have regulation. The problem is that we don't have the right regulation in some instances, correct?
That is sometimes right.
So wouldn't by implication that mean that some of the regulations that we have right now are bad?
I don't doubt that there are some. I just, off the top of my head, I don't have examples for you. And no one else has provided examples today either, I might point out, except for except for GIPSA and an NLRB rule and the Lacey Act.
Yeah, because these are things that we're testifying about today.
Well, hearings about the overall broken process and why at least the flawed regulations, only 3 have been mentioned.
And we have a whole report that's been entered into the record. How many pages? It's 30 pages of regulations that actually affect. And I just think, you know, when we talk about regulations, we have a problem because people like yourself come in here and say that there's no problem with the regulatory burden, but at the same time, they're not willing to look at regulations that are maybe outdated, that maybe we should just get rid of, because they're actually hurting the economy. They're hurting us, and you're not willing to look at any of those things.
No, I am absolutely willing to concede that obviously there could be, and there probably are somewhere out there, regulations that are unnecessary or burdensome. But we should talk about them specifically, and I think we ought to fix them where they are. But the overwhelming weight of the evidence is that regulations are wildly beneficial. They've returned a 100% rate of return for us.
You know, and the most ironic thing about your testimony was, in the end, your last line in your testimony: Congress should get to work on reducing the unnecessary burdens placed on the agencies that protect our health and environment. And it's just really beyond the pale for me to think that you think it's more important for Congress to reduce the burden on regulators than it is to reduce the burden on job creators. But my time has expired, and I will now yield. Now it's my time. And I will yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
I thank the chairman. I'm back. I'm going to ask just a final round, and I appreciate your patience and your dialogue here. But I'm going to ask something that I think crosses all of you. Some of you are very young. Some of you are a little more like me, a little less young, and some of you are in between. But I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 50s and 60s. So I grew up at a time in which we were an industrial capital, auto, steel, and rubber, plenty of coal still burning. My grandmother actually burned coal in a plain old-fashioned big thing down in the basement that just hot air rose through the house. Our buildings were black, and it wasn't until they really cleaned up the city years and years later that it was worth cleaning them off and showing the stone underneath. So I'm somebody who has appreciated clean air, clean water improvements, but I also have seen that Cleveland no longer produces cars, less engines, no rubber, no tires, steel mills are pretty well gone, and so on. So I see the balance. I want to ask you a fairly simple question, and Mr. Arkush, I'll start with you. If, in fact, regulations individually all do good things, but the price of getting cleaner air and cleaner water and less pesticides and everything else that we would like to have as goals, and certainly not losing species and so on, if the price is that our unemployment rate goes from 9% to 10% to 11% to 14% because simply the jobs created by being competitive around the world are diminished and transferred outside the country, are we better off? Or isn't there a balance that this committee and the regulatory regimen have to make sure are balanced of full employment, competitiveness, and clean air, clean water, safety, and the like?
Mr. Chairman, that is the most difficult challenge facing you and facing the regulators, obviously, when there's a difficult decision to be made between economic costs or jobs and protecting the public. Fortunately, what the evidence shows is the cost just doesn't come up, or that question isn't often posed by the regulations that our agencies produce. They overwhelmingly have benefits that outweigh the costs, even though the costs are much easier to quantify than the benefits.
And I appreciate that. I want to follow up with you quickly. When you say cost and benefits, the current benefits are, and Dr. Graham, I'm sure, can help us with this, the benefits are not necessarily global competitiveness. In other words, you can cumulatively have benefits and cumulatively become less competitive and thus lose jobs, can't you?
I think the attempt is to incorporate everything into the equation.
Dr. Graham, you're not still at OMB, but were you able to do that? During the Bush administration, there were increases in regulations, not quite at the rate that they're going now, but there were a lot of increases, and we continued losing our competitive edge against the rest of the world. Isn't that true?
Well, let me start by saying I'm a born and raised Pittsburgher, family in the steel industry.
So you've got no sympathy, being that you were from the poor cousin of the Cleveland Browns.
Yes, right. And I think that the demise of industry in cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland has a complicated history and terrain, and it has elements of not adequate technology, it has elements of labor cost, it has elements of regulation. All of this is in the story. But one thing to remember is when we do these cost-benefit analyses, we do the analyses one at a time on individual regulations. What happens, however, is when you have a suite of regulations that simultaneously hit the same sector, it's hard when we do cost-benefit analysis to handle kind of the combination of that. And there are certain sectors in our economy, and steel is certainly among them, autos is among them, mining is among them. They are really under a lot of
logging.
Logging would be another example. And we should be candid about the fact that when we do individual cost-benefit analyses of individual rules, we don't necessarily capture that combination. One final point, these huge benefits that you're hearing about from Mr. Arkush's testimony, what he's doing, he's taking some really wonderful regulations, clean air examples or automotive safety examples, he's combining them with a bunch of other regulations which aren't so great, and he's saying the overall benefits are greater than the overall cost. Well, that's true. But we shouldn't defend all of the weak or bad regulations on the grounds that there are some really great ones out there. And that's why it's important to look at this as analytically as we can.
I want to just close by noting something, Dr. Graham, that you had in your opening statement. I'm deeply concerned that the CAFE standard change was done the way it was because of process. I'm also deeply concerned that if we fudge the numbers so that an electric car gets considered to have, if you will, no pollution, well, in fact, it's fed maybe by a coal-fired electric plant, that what we're doing is forcing ourselves into one solution that may not be as good as an enhanced diesel, a hybrid, or even a conventional car, or for that matter, compressed natural gas, lots of other solutions. So In closing, I appreciate the indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to the next panel, and thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we would like to excuse the panel. We thank you for being here, and we're just going to recess for a few minutes. Thanks.
Committee will come back to order. We now recognize our second panel. The Honorable Cass Sunstein is the current Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the Office of Management and Budget, and we're very delighted to have you here today. Pursuant to the committee rules, we would appreciate if you'd rise to take the oath. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect the witness has answered in the affirmative. Administrator, you were here for the first panel, and I appreciate your being here for that entire time. I also appreciate your additional comments that have been made and your cooperation throughout this process. You're a single witness. We're not going to hold you to exactly 5 minutes, but come as close as you can. And with that, the gentleman is recognized.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's an honor and a pleasure to have the chance to appear before you to discuss issues relating to regulation and regulatory review. And I'm especially grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, and to the committee as a whole for its constructive and important work on this issue over the past months. It's very significant to try to get regulation in a place where it's helpful to the economic recovery. In the last 8 months, much of our work at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs has focused on the recent executive order on regulation, and especially on the requirement of retrospective analysis of existing rules. My written statement deals with the 500 reform proposals that have now been released to the public and the associated economic savings, which are in the billions of dollars. It's my belief that these reform initiatives and this general enterprise, which is ongoing, is consistent with the thrust of this particular hearing and the policy goals that are shared on a bipartisan basis. In these oral remarks, what I'm going to do is focus on 3 topics. First, the basic process of review under our executive orders. Second, the role of the Regulatory Flexibility Act, focused on small businesses. And third, an issue that's been discussed a great deal in the last 6 months, that is the relationship between OIRA and the independent regulatory agencies. Since 1993, under President Clinton, Executive Order 12866 has established governing principles, requirements, and processes. It builds, incidentally, on an executive order from President Reagan in 1981, which set out the fundamental charter, which continues to this day. As stated in the 1993 executive order, and to the extent permitted by law, agencies must propose or adopt a regulation only upon a reasoned determination that its benefits justify its costs, a clear endorsement of cost-benefit analysis. Second, tailor its regulations to impose the least burden on society. Third, select among alternatives the approach that maximizes net benefits. And fifth, identify and assess available alternatives to direct regulation. More freedom should be allowed if it's consistent with law. The same executive order establishes the process of centralized review, in which proposed and final significant rules are submitted to OIRA for an interagency process in which different components of the Federal Government comment on the rule that the agency proposes. OIRA is also available, and I'd like to underline this point, during the process to meet with anyone who wants to discuss regulations under review, including people who were on the previous panel. The meetings may involve business organizations, state and local governments, or congressional staff, and we've had some important ones in all of those domains over the last few years. In the vast majority of cases, the proposed or final rule is changed as a result of these processes. If the draft final rule follows public notice and comment, as is the case typically, then much of the attention of review is on public comments and concerns. In the recent past, those comments and concerns have led to fundamental rethinking of regulatory proposals. There's been some discussion of the number of rules, and we very much appreciate the concern about excessive numbers. I'd like to note, just as a supplemental point, that the number of rules issued in our first 2 years that have gone through our office is actually lower than the number in the previous 2 years under President Bush, and indeed is lower than the average, at least in the second term, of the Bush administration. Okay. The interests of small business in particular are protected by the Regulatory Flexibility Act. The Office of Advocacy of the Small Business Administration plays a crucial role in ensuring adherence to that statute, and OIRA works very closely with that office to protect small business against unjustified rules. Of special note is that office's statement from just this year, just a few months ago. As a result of improvements to the RFA, advocacy's work of small business on small businesses' behalf has required greater involvement in Federal rulemaking. The office has had more success in urging burden-reducing initiatives, and there's a list where the Office of Advocacy has had that greater success. In short, the trend is going in the right direction. As you are aware, independent regulatory agencies under both Democratic and Republican presidents have not been covered by the regulatory review process out of respect for the legal independence of those agencies. Nonetheless, President Obama, with the enthusiastic endorsement I know of many on both sides of the aisle, took a significant and novel step with a different executive order which states that independent agencies should follow the cost-reducing requirements of our executive order and should engage in the process of retrospective review. Our hope is that as a consequence, a direct consequence, the nation will see significant improvements and significant savings, significant reductions in regulatory burdens. We're encouraged by the early results from the independent agencies. With that said, I am looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. And because Mr. Gowdy has a crucial other committee at work, I would yield first to Mr. Gowdy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Professor, for your testimony. This is actually not a trick question. I will read you the same quote I read to the first panel. We should have no more regulation than the health, safety, and security the American people require. That was a quote from the President. Do you agree with that?
I agree with my boss.
That's why I said it wasn't a trick question. I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble. At 9.2% unemployment, I don't want to add to it. Is there anything that should have been added to that series?
Health, safety, security, I think it's pretty comprehensive.
Do you know or are you familiar with someone by the name of Dudley Butler?
I do not know that name offhand.
If he were an administrator, either past or present, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Grain Inspection, Packers and Stockyards Administration, there would be no reason for you to know him, I don't imagine, and you don't have to know him to be able to answer my question. He referred to a proposed rule as a plaintiff lawyer's dream. Would you agree that that is not an appropriate factor to be considered in the promulgation of a rule or regulation?
I wouldn't want to say anything negative about a colleague whom I don't know and for which I don't know the context exactly. I would say in general, the question is whether regulation conforms to the law and existing executive orders, and the question is not whether it's someone's dream.
Violations of rules and regulations, are they ever considered evidence of negligence in civil litigation?
That is possible. It depends on the context.
Violations of rules and regulations, are they ever considered negligence per se in civil litigation?
You know, I'd want to bone up on my tort law, but it wouldn't be stunning if the answer were yes.
So an ancillary reason to be concerned about what some perceive to be the excessive promulgation of rules and regulations would be that it contributes to what some believe is an already litigious society.
This is a very important question, the relationship between Federal regulation and tort law, and you're on to something, if I may say, that it would be very valuable for all of us to have clarity on, that sometimes what happens is a regulation displaces state tort law, it eliminates it. Sometimes it, as your question suggests, it kind of puts state tort law on steroids because it gives a tool to the plaintiff that didn't exist before, and whether the preemption or the, let's say, enhancement of state tort law is desirable very much depends on the context. I do take your point that there are contexts in which the amplification of the civil liability system that the regulation, let's call it the non-preemptive regulation, creates, can be harmful. There are such situations.
Are you familiar with and do you support in theory the REINS Act, which is pending in the House?
I am familiar with that. The administration agrees with the cost reduction goals of the advocates of the REINS Act. The administration does not favor the REINS Act on the ground that the tool it gives to Congress already has to eliminate rules, and that there's a risk that the REINS Act would have unintended consequences. Just to give you one example, when I last looked at the text, it would sweep up deregulatory initiatives in its ambit, and so our efforts to eliminate costly rules would be delayed and possibly indefinitely by this new and very dramatic departure from longstanding practice.
Do you agree in general that Congress has abdicated its responsibility for filling in the details of legislation to executive branch entities?
Well, I wouldn't want to make a general statement on that because there are many laws, as you know, which are quite detailed and prescriptive, where the executive has exceeding little discretion. There are others where it has large discretion. And in those cases in which it has large discretion, whether it's an abdication or a recognition of changing circumstances or the need for technical expertise, depends on the area. I do understand that many people on both sides of the aisle have been concerned about excessive delegation under some statutes.
My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the ranking member and would ask unanimous consent that he have one additional minute. I shorted or excessed myself at the end. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot of rhetoric in the committee and on the House floor describing regulations as job killers. But regulations perform a critical role in implementing some of our most important laws, such as the Clean Air Act. EPA estimates that in 2010 alone, the Clean Air Act prevented over 160,000 premature deaths. And those are real people who are alive today because of these protections. Majority Leader Cantor sent a memo to House Republicans on August the 29th, laying out the Republican leadership's agenda for the fall. The memo identifies a list of agency rules the Republican leadership wants to eliminate. These include rules aimed at protecting public health, the environment, and workers' rights. Mr. Cantor's memo makes assertions about the cost of these rules, but does not discuss the benefits. Mr. Sunstein, shouldn't any evaluation of an agency rule include analysis of the benefits the rule provides?
Absolutely, yes.
Of course, I believe we can always improve regulations to make them better. In fact, the President issued an executive order in January that required agencies to review existing regulations and streamline them when appropriate. In response, agencies developed draft plans in May, and the public was given the opportunity to comment on those plans. As you highlighted in your testimony, those plans include over 500 initiatives that are expected to save more than $6 billion over the next 5 years. I understand that the agencies were tasked with developing these plans while considering both the costs and benefits of these rules. How were they able to find such significant savings while still ensuring the health, safety, and protections provided by these rules? Were they just outdated? Did circumstances change?
Right.
Did any of them have anything to do with new technology then making them obsolete? Tell us about that, because I think that can provide us guidance with regard to what we are trying to do, and that is strike a balance between making sure that we have rules that we really need to protect the health, welfare, and the safety of Americans, but at the same time get rid of those that just don't make sense anymore?
It's a great question, and at some
Thank
point,
you.
at some point, probably a book will be written about how agencies were able to identify so many reforms, and the $6 billion figure I identify, I think we're going to be able to do a lot better than that. That's just a small fraction of the 500 reforms. Let me give you an example by way of getting into your question. The EPA has actually proposed to eliminate tens of millions of dollars in annual expense put on small business owners because of air pollution requirements for gas stations, which are not helpful because modern cars already control the air pollution. You don't need the gas stations to do it, so it's completely redundant. That's a case where the rule, when issued, at least for all I know, served a function, but it doesn't serve a function anymore. And there are other regulations like that where at the origin it made some sense, but the technology, as you say, has evolved. Some of the savings involve just learning from experience. For example, we have OSHA eliminating 1.9 million hours in paperwork and reporting requirements imposed on employers. OSHA's learned that those aren't helping worker safety. They are providing some information, but it's not information that the government needs in order to do its job. So that's when you learn, and I'm excited about this for our future unbreaking those aspects of the regulatory system that are working so well, just learning how things are operating on the ground. There are other things, and this is maybe relevant to your job, where a law as enacted may overshoot a bit because the text may sweep up conduct that doesn't really cause the harms that the law is designed to prevent. So we have an oil spill rule, which is serving important functions, but the definition of oil turned out to include milk. Well, there's a difference between milk and oil in terms of environmental harm, and a lot of work had to be done to exempt milk and dairy industry from onerous regulatory requirements. Because Congress got alert to the problem, it gave EPA the authority to fix it. It took a while to fix it, and with the President's action, it got fixed in a hurry. There are other categories of things where there are compliance dates, for example, or requirements that are issued in one year, which when the relevant year comes around, it just doesn't make much sense anymore given the economic situation. And so you may have noticed, it got a lot of publicity, that states and localities all over the country were asked, and this was by the Bush administration acting in good faith, to change their street signs and traffic controls. By the time the compliance date came along, there's new font size requires, and states and localities are saying, you're asking us to spend millions of dollars when there's not an ascertainable safety benefit. And the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary LaHood, was very concerned and thought, given our current situation, this is not what states and localities have to do. So we propose to take away that multimillion-dollar burden.
Well, the method that is being used to get to those kinds of situations that you just stated, and I guess it's like a screening process, like when you're, it's like you got tea and you got to pour through the tea to get what you want, but you don't want it. You want to keep something there. Strainer. Right. Do we have a sufficient strainer? You understand what I'm saying? In other words, are we catching? Do you feel like we put together the mechanisms to catch? Is this in my 6 minutes? Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I don't have an abstract answer to that question, but I do think that it's often the case that laws, like regulations, have unintended adverse consequences, including unintended coverage. Mm-hmm. And what we found with our look-back process, and not infrequently with our notice and comment process, is that if we just listen to people who are running businesses or otherwise affected by our rules, they can tell us things that can help create a good strainer.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walbert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you for being here, Mr. Sunstein. And two issues I want to address with you. The first being GIPSA. And I take that in reference to a point that Representative Gowdy was attempting to get out, and you appropriately chose not to answer based upon colleagues' statements that you clearly weren't aware of. But I do want, for the record, to make sure that we understand in relation to this GIPSA question and the fact of being a former member of the House Ag Committee that passed the 2008 Farm Bill and did a lot of work on making sure that that issue, GIPSA, was covered well and regulations were put in place realistically. And a concern now that USDA and GIPSA have gone well beyond the intent of Congress in those that proposal and those regulations. Mr. Dudley Butler, J. Dudley Butler, in commenting about the rule and its ability to allow for more litigation in the future, he said this. He said, and I quote, "When you have a term like unfair, unreasonable, or undue prejudice, that's a plaintiff lawyer's dream. We can get in front," and that's my concern, we can get in front of a jury with that. We won't get thrown out on what we call summary judgment because that's a jury question. I think you would justifiably understand our concern when a regulator makes that type of statement in relationship to GIPSA. Let me go on and ask a question here. As you may know, multiple studies have been released questioning the economic impact of the proposed rule and what it would be doing and the cost that there would be there, which would result to more than $100 million. Will you consider having the rule withdrawn and having the USDA initiate a more thorough economic impact study before going forward?
Well, thank you for that. If the rule has $100 million in annual impact, then it's required to have an economic analysis associated with it. So that's just, simple and straightforward. And if originally a rule comes in, in answer to the Chairman's question, originally it was proposed, didn't look like it would have $100 million, and then it turns out it's gonna, then at the final stage it has to have that analysis.
So even though initially it looked like the study that was done in a cursory fashion to make sure that it didn't cross the $100 million level, if it ultimately shows that it's going to be more, you're telling me that there will indeed.
There will be a regulatory impact analysis, with will in italics.
Well, we will certainly look for that. Let me move forward here on the silica issue. And I chair a subcommittee that deals with MSHA. And a lot of minds are concerned, and farmers and others, because sand is certainly, as you know, everywhere. Currently, OIRA is reviewing OSHA's proposed changes to the silica standard. This proposal has been under review for almost 6 months, and I appreciate the fact that it is still under review and has not come out. Because if it were to come out, there's some significant concerns on my part. On August 18, 2011, I copied OMB on a letter asking OSHA to publish an advance notice of proposal rulemaking in order to allow for stakeholders to understand what changes are being contemplated. I await that response. In that letter, I noted that the cost estimated of lowering the standard would be between $3 to $5 billion by a small business panel in 2003 that looked into it. Additionally, the lowering of the standard, which has been effective so far in that silicosis is going down, it's not going up. The lowering of the standard by half, which is what many in the affected industries are expecting, would effectively lower the limit to be virtually impossible to enforce. Can you explain how OIRA is reviewing the proposed regulation and its impact on job creation?
Yes, I'm pleased to do that. I should avoid discussing the details of the particular rule under review, but I can tell you some general principles that bear on all rules. The first is conformity to law. That's our #1 priority. That's the foundation. And there are requirements in the Occupational Safety and Health Act, including feasibility requirements that would be relevant to any OSHA rule and many other agencies' rules which have a feasibility or achievability constraint built into the law. apart from the law, there's the executive order, which requires quantification to the extent feasible of all costs and benefits. That bears on the rules discussed earlier, as well as this one. Within the constraints of the law, there are principles that the new executive order has in it, including public participation, engagement with relevant stakeholders, an open exchange of ideas, flexibility, meaning give people room to maneuver, because that tends to make economic sense. It also promotes freedom. That's in our executive order. So the law would be the first requirement. Our executive order would set the second level of details for analysis. Within the framework of the executive order, probably the most important point here to emphasize is even when a rule is under review, before it's proposed for comment, and this hasn't been proposed for comment, people's concerns are very welcome in the form of meetings as well as letters. So we have had a number of meeting requests on this one in which relevant information has been provided, and that definitely plays a role in the review process.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the longtime businessman, job creator, and Congressman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for the longtime job creator. It's been in the family business for 57 years. So, Professor, it's nice to have you with us again, and thank you so much for being here. One of the things that Dr. Graham talked about was that the bureaucrats in EPA and NHTSA artificially inflated the benefits of their CAFE and greenhouse gas rulemakings for both light-duty and heavy-duty cars and trucks by declaring that society would enjoy a social benefit from tighter mileage standards and assigning it a savings of anywhere from $21 to $45 for each ton of carbon not emitted. Did the agencies present any type of science to back that up?
Yes. That number is a result of a very lengthy report that reflected the views of the Council of Economic Advisors, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce, as well as the Office of Management and Budget. And any report that gets consensus from that diverse set of officials either would say nothing or be maybe pretty solid.
Okay, so and that range then from $21 to $45 a ton, that's a pretty big range for all those people that weighed in on it.
Yes, it actually is a somewhat larger range where the $21 is the central value, but at the low end it goes well below 21, and at the high end it goes into the 60s.
Yeah, earlier one of our colleagues from Virginia was talking about, had the American auto manufacturers not found an end run to get around the CAFE standards in the 70s, that they would not have faced some of the challenges they had. And I was actually selling cars during that time period. CAFE standards really don't drive the market. The price of gasoline does. And I remember that very specifically, that whatever our standard was at that time wasn't really based on market conditions. It's, again, based on standards that somebody came up with that they thought would be better than what we were currently doing, with the concern for we were running out of this fuel. And I can remember a Newsweek with the needle being on E and saying we're running out of this and we're running out of that. And a lot of that stuff has since then, we're finding out that we do have vast stores of oil. We do have an awful lot available to us. But I'm always perplexed. And you said, and I thought this was very good, you said we need to listen to the people who actually run these businesses. And I would agree with that. And I'm a guy that's a General Motors dealer. I'm trying to understand a Chevy Bolt. If it has such a great value and is such a significant part of our transportation strategy as we go forward, it should pretty much sell itself. And the fact that General Motors isn't putting a rebate on it, but the American taxpayers are putting $7,500 into every Volt that's sold, and these are not being bought and snapped up by people who say, boy, this is a great car for me to own. This is something I'm going to run out to the dealership and buy. I mean, we're being asked to take this car and stock it, which is a poor business practice. I usually don't like to have anything on my shelf that I can't turn in 45 or 60 days. It's kind of led into our family being able to survive for 60 years in the business. But I have people telling me, no, you have to stock this. You don't understand. This is the way the market's going. And I'm trying to understand, because your comment, listen to the people who run these businesses. Where in the world do we get a chance to do that?
There are a couple of ways, and one thing we're really trying to do is to spur this at our little office, which is when we have a rule under review, sometimes it will have been proposed formally to the public so people have a good sense of what it might look like. GIPSA is an example of that. That has been formally proposed. When it is at—
Well, if we could, and I understand those, but when we're talking about transportation, and most of us at some time in our life actually go into a car dealership and sit down, pick out a car and negotiate the price and then buy it. So I'm not getting into the silicons and everything else. I'm talking about specifically who were the people that were involved in coming up with some of this great strategy as to what we should be driving in the future.
With respect to the fuel economy?
With respect to the people who buy these, because at some point we're legislating and we're regulating people out of the market. We're raising the prices of transportation, personal transportation, so high that their only choice is being going to public transportation or finding another way to get from point A to point B. And we're going to drive them from their suburban settings back into their urban settings because they can't get there effectively. And that really does concern me. Again, government picking and choosing the way we will choose our personal transportation.
Okay. Well, before any rule that involves automobiles is finalized, and the one you're referring to is an example, it's presented to the public for comments. And if automobile companies or automobile dealers have a problem with it, that plays
But that's actually not true, and you know that's not true. No, it's the government decides what the CAFE is going to be, what the gas mileage is going to be, and then holds the car manufacturers hostage in order to meet these regulations. The cost of building these vehicles, by the way, is going to be so burdensome that public transport or private transportation as we know it is no longer going to be viable. We know that. No, the public does not weigh in on this. This is really, when you talk about overregulation in a government that wields its weight way too much, that's exactly what's happening in private transportation. And I would suggest that this country, which is built on private transportation, needs to take a look at what's happening.
I thank the gentleman.
And I thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you. We now go to another past job creator, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Sunstein, thank you for your hard work. You have taken on a very difficult task of weeding out some of these regulations. I think you're working with a scalpel. If you're not successful pretty soon, I think we're going to come in after you with a machete, because I think it's something that needs to be taken care of. I want to start off by addressing something of particular interest to the state of Texas, and that's specifically the cross-state air pollution rule. And this is a symptom that we're seeing on multiple occasions in Texas. We saw it with the dune sagebrush lizard, where Texas is not originally included in the original proposals and not given an opportunity to take part in the rulemaking process. And then as the final rule comes out or is about to come out, all of a sudden we are thrown in there. And it's about a month ago, I think almost the entire Texas delegation sent you a letter with respect to these cross-state air pollution rules. Have you had a chance to read that letter and follow up on your offer, maybe to help us out on that?
Well, yes, definitely. That letter followed a discussion I had with almost the entire Texas delegation, both Democrats and Republicans. And subsequent to that, receiving that letter, I've transmitted it to the Environmental Protection Agency, which I can assure you is thinking intensely about the issues that were raised.
All right, let's just step back now and look at a broader perspective. You're seeing now agencies more and more going into these emergency rulemaking procedures where the rules take effect immediately and end up being in effect permanently. Do you think we've maybe broadened the definition of what an emergency is beyond what the average American citizen would think is an emergency?
You're taking me back to my days as an administrative law teacher. The Administrative Procedure Act allows agencies to dispense with notice and comment rulemaking when it's unnecessary, impracticable, or contrary to the public interest. That's the statutory term. Sometimes that's referred in shorthand as an emergency exception, which I think is a useful way of reminding everyone, maybe particularly agencies, that the ordinary course is to go through notice and comment. What I believe and what OIRA is firmly committed to, and what the President, more importantly, has directed us as of January 18th to be firmly committed to, is a 60-day notice and comment period unless there's some very unusual circumstance.
And can you talk a little bit about sue and settle, where agencies are basically forced to implement rules as a result of a lawsuit from an activist group and basically sidestepping the normal procedure that way as well?
Well, I think there are a couple of different situations that rubric might capture. Let's describe the optimistic one first. The optimistic one is where the plaintiff, it could be a company that wants to avoid a burden, it could be an environmental group that wants to clean the air or the water, has a really good argument on the merits, let's suppose. And then the agency decides we're going to lose. Why don't we enter into a settlement agreement, which will give us, in some cases, more flexibility and room to maneuver than could happen if the case went to trial. So that is completely legitimate. All I would say as OIRA administrator for that one is that it should be clear that the public comment process and the legal requirements of the statute and the requirements of the executive order, including careful cost-benefit analysis, choice of least burdensome alternative, et cetera, to the extent permitted by law, all have their appropriate play.
I would love to sit down with you over coffee and have about 30 minutes to discuss that and the separation of powers issues associated with it on a former lawyer to law professor level. But I've only got about 30 seconds left, so I want to just pose one more thought for your consumption as well as those that are watching. Historically, we've had scientists that are running these government agencies and in leadership posts. And I think now more than ever we're seeing political appointees, and very often political appointees from activist organizations that are taking over leadership roles in executive branch regulatory agencies. Do you see that as a trend and or as a problem?
It's a great question, and I don't have enough kind of data about what the trends have been. What I would say is very clear after my 2.5 years at this office is that scientific issues are often fundamental to regulatory decisions, and I agree with you, the scientific decisions have to be made by scientists, not by people who are political.
Thank you very much. I see I'm out of time.
That's a rare sight you have. Okay, well, I guess I will recognize myself for 5 minutes, and if no one else returns, you're done. I bet you somebody else will show up, though. It just always happens. It's a busy day, and I appreciate your understanding of people going in and out. I'm going to just do some follow-up here. In the case of the GIPSA situation, one in which it wasn't $100 million, now it is $100 million, perhaps multi-billion. In addition to, obviously, this economic review, would you commit to ensuring that there is a public comment period opened as there would have been had we realized that it was at least 10 times $100 million initially?
Because the Secretary of Agriculture has the statutory lead.
What you mean is you've already been told no, so the answer is no?
Definitely not. So I would not say no to that, because the general proposition, not only do I agree with, I think it's fundamentally important that in general, the cost-benefit analysis has to be exposed to the public so that you can figure out whether the assessment might have something wrong in it.
Right. Don't make me buy something when I find out the price afterwards.
Exactly. So what I will commit to is engaging with the USDA on exactly that issue.
I appreciate that, and I realize under the law that's the most we could ask for. Would you agree to do essentially the same thing in the case of CAFE, where we're sort of got the cart before the horse, and a additional comment and process could be helpful?
There is no question that before that rule is finalized, there needs to be a public comment process, not only on the ultimate numbers, but on every ingredient of the numbers, as is standard.
Okay. And as you might have heard, I know you heard earlier with Dr. Graham, concerns about the benefit analysis, particularly the weighting of electric cars as though they commit, if you say there's no pollution when there is pollution, you're obviously distorting the cost-benefit consideration. So hopefully that would be something you'd commit to do. Would you say, from your position, that executive orders per se fall very far short of legislative action?
In general, legislative action has more longevity than executive orders. That I would say.
Well, the reason I ask you, and this was, Mr. Gowdy doesn't do traps, I enjoy doing this one, is my staff gave me this question because in 2002, in the law review article you co-authored, it states that executive orders are not per se, semicolon, they are not sufficient for real change. That was a position that I think was accurate, that executive orders exist in the vacuum of something defined, and that something defined and put into statute in one procedure or another, rulemaking in some cases, and clearly legislation being normally the first, is the only thing that has longevity. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, in general, it's turned out that the Reagan executive order from the early 80s, and I happened to be at the Justice Department at the time, so in the Reagan administration, that the basic framework has lasted for decades. And my hope is, and my belief is, that this is now regulatory review in one or another form is a permanent part of our regulatory structure.
But regulatory laws, like a declaration of war, are there until they're repealed. Executive orders, for example, the executive order that everyone said year after year was great, which is we won't assassinate a foreign head of state, it was only good until the first time a secret executive order said go get them. So the executive order actually meant nothing, nothing at all year after year after year. I'm a little concerned that if we don't come to that agreement, that an executive order is appropriate in order to guide the executive branch in the absence of guidance, which is appropriate, but that ultimately if that guidance is intended to be acted on permanently, it should be codified in law as a regular matter of course.
Well,
and I'll take, for example, the Mineral Management Service, created by executive order under President Reagan. I think it's Reagan. Dysfunctional, hopeless organization, reviewed and always having problems. And part of the problem was that it really hadn't, it was put together conceptually and then never really dealt with after that. And of course, President Obama made it very clear in the reorganization that that needed to be done now.
I hear you. And the kind of statutory requirements that overlap with the executive order, including the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, and the Regulatory Flexibility Act, those are all statutory, and we are strongly supportive of them.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a break on the first round and go to the gentleman from Maryland for a second round first. Go ahead, Mr.
This is only going to take a second. One of the things that I am concerned about is how President Obama is portrayed. And, I just listened to you talk about this whole look-back process. I hear my Republican colleagues beat up on President Obama. And it gets a little bit emotional for me, to be frank with you. Because here's a president that's probably doing more than just about any other president in looking back. Am I right? Did Bush do this? Did President Bush do this?
No one has done it in this system.
I mean like this.
Right. Agreed.
And so, I think the President, in fairness to him, heard our colleagues and tried to create a balanced approach to trying to do this. And the reason why I bring this up is based upon the answers to the questions that you just gave to the Chairman. He asked you about this rule. You said, okay, we're looking back. You talk about the screening process. We're doing that. And that is the balanced approach that makes sense. As a matter of fact, I think if it were done that way, there's not a person on this committee that would, I don't think, that would disagree with that, with the understanding that there's some things that become outdated, and you explained it quite well, why it is, how you're able to find those kinds of rules that are outdated that there are problems with and that we need to get rid of. All of us want to create jobs. God knows. I've got in my district probably a 35% African-American male unemployment rate, black. I want to create jobs. I also want them to be in safe jobs. Now, going back to the GIPSA rule, the letter that was admitted in the record a little bit earlier has a piece in here which I found very interesting. And I know the young lady who testified on this talked about there were a lot of organizations that did not, that were not related to this whole agricultural situation. But the 15 to sign this, well, maybe about 14 to sign this letter, the Campaign for Contract Agriculture Reform, Center for Rural Affairs, Dakota's Resource Council. Anyway, I go on and on. All of them are agriculture related, the 14 to sign this letter. But one of the things, the one that was admitted into the record, the question is, they've got a paragraph here that says, and this is why this is so interesting, it says, this is part of the letter. Prior to the proposed rule, USDA held numerous meetings with all parties with an interest in the proposed rule. After issuing the proposed rule, USDA took a step of extending the comment period to 120 days, an extraordinary period time for regulatory comment period. The comment period on the proposed rule closed on November 22, 2011. Over 60,000 comments were submitted on the proposed rule, including numerous detailed comments addressing the potential economic benefits and costs of the proposed rule. USDA also responded to the requests of livestock, poultry packers, processors to assign the USDA chief economist to oversee preparation of a comprehensive economic analysis of the GIPSA final rule. To date, USDA has taken almost 10 months in its review of the public comments. The regulatory process of the GIPSA proposed rule has been lengthy, thorough, open, and even-handed. And even with all of that, and I'm not knocking you for doing it, I'm glad you're doing a look back, because I want it to be fair. Even with all of that, you're still saying, we'll take a look at it. And I think, and I'm just going on the record to say that, I think we ought to be fair to to President Obama. At least he's trying to look back at something. I mean, this has already gone through a process. The other problem that I see, and somebody talked about it a little bit earlier, and it kind of comes up in this. The rulemaking can take so long. And going back to what the chairman was saying, and I thought he made a very good point, is that sometimes by the time the rule comes up, it's outdated, and it doesn't make any sense anymore. So, I just asked you a comment. I only got 11 seconds, 10 seconds. Would you comment on that? Well, and I'm not knocking the chairman or anything. I just want a fair process.
Yeah, there are a lot of important points there. So it is true that sometimes the process of issuing rules is slower than it ought to be, including deregulatory rules. There's no question about that. And many people applauded our rule that eliminated milk producers from the oil spill rule, and I thought, what took you so long? So completely agree with that. So it would be good to think of ways to streamline not only rules, but processes for issuing rules when there's a good reason to think that the rules would do some good. And if we can work together on that, it would fit very well with our look-back process, but also where there's an urgent public safety or health need, that would also be a good thing. We got a rule out that's preventing, I think, 79,000 illnesses from salmonella in eggs. It also exempts, by the way, small farmers who aren't the source of the problem. So it's protective of small business as well as the American public. Many people thought that rule, which has benefits well in excess of costs, took too long to get out. The protection was slower than it ought to have been.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself. We've spent a lot of time on GIPSA. Fortunately, you came very prepared, so that's helpful. I'm sure you're familiar that in the 2008 Farm Bill, in the discussion draft, now this, remember, not to be partisan, but to be descriptive, Republican President, but a Democratic House and Senate. The language included in the discussion draft at the Senate committee markup of the Farm Bill included the provision that would have allowed for what the rule is being proposed to do, which is not requiring a plaintiff in order to have a lawsuit. So, considered by the Democratic Senate at the time, rejected, law happens without it. On what basis, fundamental basis, does the branch of execution get to do something that was rejected by, or reasonably believed to be rejected by, the body that created the law?
Well, that would be hard to identify such a basis unless it's the case that the statutory text authorized the Secretary of Agriculture to do this. And so the earlier question suggested that this goes beyond congressional intent. If so, that's a very serious problem. If there's a delegation of authority to the Secretary to resolve this question, that would be the only possible answer.
Well, and let's go through something, because it's a unique opportunity, or not unique because you've been very generous to come here and come here again now, but we'll ask you back again. But because of the regulatory process, and because, quite frankly, C-SPAN and other groups sort of help us get out some constitutional questions, the Founding Fathers did not have regulatory language in the Constitution. They did not envision the executive branch passing laws. This is something that was created afterwards, and it didn't set limits. So let's go through a process. In order to make a law currently, the House and the Senate have to pass bills that are identical through an initial process or through conference. They then have to send it to a President and have it either signed, or, if vetoed, they must override it with 2/3 of both houses. That's the law. Once a law is in place, if the executive branch, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point, the executive branch chooses to, quite frankly, extract out of pure air or thin cloth some ability to add another law. Regulations are laws. Rules are laws. The only way that that can be stopped is either through a very unusual court challenge, which is rare because they defer to us to fix it, or a 2/3 majority of the House and the Senate telling the President he's wrong effectively. We can do it through an ordinary majority, but then he can veto it. So isn't that the current status of the balance between a rule chosen by the President, or even an executive order, is that he can do anything he wants to do, he being the executive branch, that the Congress doesn't have a 2/3 majority to stop? Isn't that part of the balance that currently exists?
I hope that that's more pessimistic than reality.
And by the way, I wasn't saying this happens regularly or that there isn't consultation, but ultimately, isn't that one of the realities, is that the check and balance of, we can have oversight, but to actually say we don't approve of your rule, we have to get majorities in the House and the Senate in order to do it, and on top of that in a timely fashion, or we have to pass a new law, start to finish, and strike it down.
I'd just add 2 points. One is that if a rule is proposed by an executive agency, the General Counsel's office at the Department, call it the Department of Transportation, which has a superb General Counsel, is carefully—
Has a superb Cabinet officer, too.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. Is very much engaged on the question whether the rule conforms to congressional instructions. And so the first line of defense is the lawyers at the General Counsel's office. If that is—
But they're executive branch employees.
Yes, though it happens time and again, I can say this from experience, that the General Counsel's office or subsequent people engaged in the legal issue will say, that's not what Congress meant, that's not consistent with—
Well, let's go through the process. Congress recently acted, and we've acted previously, to set CAFE standards. We have, in fact, been the creators and the setter of CAFE standards. Delegated to NHTSA. How do we get these CAFE standards this time? Didn't we get them around clear congressional intent, and isn't that part of why it's so controversial?
Well, if you could imagine NHTSA doing some things that would be in plain violation of the underlying statute, and that would come out, the inconsistency with the underlying statute.
Well, but understand, the President said he did this without Congress. So, it's very clear that the President did it without Congress. He did it without the process that has existed in the past. Where, to your knowledge, was there an intent of Congress to have the executive branch from time to time raise those standards on their own?
Okay. That would be the fuel economy statute, which, as you said, delegates authority to the Department of Transportation. So it was without Congress in one respect. That is, that Congress didn't particularly select levels or mechanisms, but it was pursuant to a delegation of authority to the agency, which is a constrained delegation. And in fact, NHTSA has run into legal challenges for, not in this administration, but in prior administrations, for not acting consistently with the legal constraints, or at least so it was challenged. So what's clear is that there couldn't be the creation of a CAFE standard, just out of thin air.
Well, yes, but my time has expired, so let me do this. I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania and ask him if he'd yield me back time.
I will do that, sir.
The gentleman is recognized. Quickly, under the ESA Act, conveniently similar to my name, we prohibited EPA from doing this, and yet they've done it. So we can have a lot of argument, the courts may ultimately have arguments, but isn't it clear that the President's administration made a decision to do this, and they made a decision to do it without precedent, specifically based on actions that were created by Congress? And I know you're not a constitutional, you're a very good scholar, you're not a constitutional scholar per se, but isn't this
once upon a time?
Well, but isn't this becoming a constitutional question? And isn't that one of those in which the American people have to ask, do they trust this administration, the next administration? You didn't trust the last administration in some of your writings. And shouldn't we ultimately seize back a great deal of this through some process that says, go ahead and make your rules, but ultimately you have to get Congress's buy-in in real time?
Well, what I would say is that there are a couple of things that are built into our system that are responsive to your question. The first is one of the President's core constitutional responsibilities is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So adherence to the law is at the heart of the executive power under Article 2. It's also the case that Congress has mechanisms which have been used to express its
You mean the exactly one time wherever it will shut down a rule?
Well, I didn't just mean the Congressional Review Act. I also meant offering input and criticism of the direction in which any executive branch is going, and we've seen a couple of examples in the last hours. And I can't emphasize strongly enough that if there's a rule that's under review at our office, or that the Department of Transportation, let's say, is devising, that seems to those who are responsible for the legislation to be inconsistent with it, that voice matters greatly to the
Let me ask you one last question, and I appreciate the continued indulgence of the gentleman. If we were to pass a law today that said the President must, on a quarterly basis, bring us his package of regulations for a package vote up or down, essentially give us the right to vote as a package, and if we didn't like it, we'd vote the package down if it was sufficient, wouldn't that make those regulations truly bought in by the American people, and wouldn't it make it inherently harder to pass a regulation? And by the way, the same would be true of rolling back legislation. The gentleman very rightfully so said concern about regulations going away. But isn't that the best way to have the confidence of the American people potentially, rather than the arguments that have gone on here today?
I don't know what would be the best way to have the confidence of the American people. I do know.
Let's switch it to it. Wouldn't we pass less regs if in fact the President had to come to Congress with his package of regs to get codification, rather than passing them, as, if you will, sua sponte?
There'd be fewer regs and fewer deregs, and whether that diminution in number would pass the cost-benefit test, that's the question.
And it is a good one. I yield back to the gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Professor, again, thanks for your indulgence. I know this can't be easy. Going back to this CAFE, because I think it's important for the American people to understand. And my concern with all of this is it doesn't matter what President's watch it happens on. Whoever it is that's sitting in the chair either gets the praise or the blame. So it really it's truly a bipartisan criticism. With CAFE, though, and what has always bothered me, we are able, as a government, to eliminate consumer choice by coming up with these standards? If you could just help me on that. And I think I have a better understanding right now after the Chairman's last line of questioning. But it's disturbing to me because we really are eliminating, we're picking and choosing what people are allowed to drive and not drive or purchase and not purchase. The market really determines that. And I would say that as far as gas mileage is concerned, when the price of gasoline goes up, people go to smaller cars. It doesn't really have anything to do with CAFE. So if you could.
Okay. The recent announcement by the President is the initiation of a process that will involve engagement with a number of the issues that have been raised today, including public notice and comment on issues, including consumer choice issues. What I'd emphasize with respect to CAFE standards is that there's been kind of bipartisan enthusiasm for assessment of costs and benefits. And at least the CAFE standards that have been issued in this administration have had benefits very far in excess of costs, really extraordinarily far in excess of costs, and have also allowed a very great room for consumer choice. So it would be one thing to say, every car has to get 50 miles per gallon. It would be another thing to say that there's a fleet-wide average of X, and the number of cars that are on the road can span an extraordinarily wide range. And consistent with the executive order, which values flexibility and freedom of choice, I'm with you that any CAFE structure should have a wide range of options rather than be draconian. So one question, which really isn't for the OIRA administrator to answer, it's for the people who are authorized by Article 1 of the Constitution, you all, to answer. The question is whether the economic, energy security, and environmental benefits of a CAFE standard justify such restrictions as there are on the market. And there was a report, I believe, in the early 2000s from the National Academy of Sciences, a very detailed report by a wide range of respected people, which ultimately concluded was supportive of Congress's judgment, which is in favor of CAFE standards.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Again, I do want to thank you for coming up. I'm sure it's never pleasant to testify before a congressional committee. According to a recent Wall Street Journal article, the Obama administration considered but ultimately rejected a partial moratorium on new regulations. Is that correct?
Well, the Wall Street Journal, I believe, said that. That is correct.
Were you? Well, did they? Are you aware of? Well, there was a. Were you involved in any discussions about that?
What I am aware of is that in any domain that bears on economic policy, a wide range of questions come up, and any administration that is determined to help make things better, as ours is, would consider every question that a reasonable person might ask, and it is true that a number of people on the outside have raised that question. So, I mean, I guess, and I don't mean to try to pin you down. I mean, are you aware of any of the issues that were considered in not implementing that moratorium? Okay, I can tell you a bit about why a moratorium is not coming, if that would be helpful. One problem, which is closely related to the previous chairman's, your immediate predecessor in that chair, the executive has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. A moratorium would violate the requirement that the laws be faithfully executed. So it would have to be a highly qualified moratorium. Second, a moratorium would sweep up deregulatory measures, which we are pretty enthusiastic about expediting, because they are regulatory actions. And third, and this is an important point, a moratorium would not be a scalpel or a machete. It would be more like a nuclear bomb, in the sense that it would prevent regulations that, let's say, cost very little and have very significant economic or public health benefits. So a moratorium would have the disadvantage of defying what every president since President Reagan has endorsed, which is cost-benefit analysis. Now, we were talking a partial moratorium, and it seems this administration has not been has not stopped itself from picking and choosing which laws it
chooses to affect. I mean, we've seen the administration publicly say they're not going to enforce the Defense of Marriage Act, for example. So it's something they could do if they chose to do.
Well, what I would say is in the regulatory apparatus, to say we won't issue rules that Congress has required us to issue, that would violate the Take Care Clause.
I'm not going to advocate either side on that. I just wanted to follow up on that article. In his opening statement, I don't believe you were here, but opening statement for the first panel, Chairman Mica of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee held up a chart with the amount and level of government regulations associated with building a highway. His number says it takes about 6 years to build a highway, basically saying shovel-ready basically does not exist in the amount of time. I question how some of these regulatory agencies sleep at night knowing as they delay these, people are not going back to work and not on a job. Do you have any solutions for this that we could, anything that, I realize you are working on it from your end. Do you have some things we could do on our end? We're costing ourselves money, tripling the price of highway projects and delaying getting people back to work.
I agree completely that there is a problem with permitting requirements that, at least in some important cases, are having unfortunate delaying effects on desirable projects. I agree completely with that. If we have rules coming forward that add to that problem, they will have close scrutiny. What I would suggest, just as in this case a consumer rather than an important actor, that engagement with the Jobs Council, the President's Jobs Council here, would be very helpful. They are centrally concerned about this topic. Jeff Zients, who is the Deputy Director at OMB, is centrally concerned with this problem. And it would be very good in this current economic situation as an opportunity to improve the permitting process.
And as a Texan, Texas kind of prides itself on being a business-friendly, as little regulation as possible state. And one of the ways we were able to maintain that is all executive agencies in Texas face a sunset process and have to come back before the legislature to justify their existence. Do you see a benefit in adopting something like that on a Federal level?
It may be too rigid, but I'll tell you what I do see a benefit in that's closely analogous, is to take our look-back process not as a one-shot endeavor, but as a location for the creation of teams and institutions that are constantly, and not just because a President says so in a prominent document, but are constantly looking at rules to see if they should be eliminated. And if you look at the plans, and we could certainly use your help on this, they say that this is a continuing endeavor. If members of the public see rules, including permitting-related rules, that are causing harm, or rules that are not consistent with how technologies now operate, or rules that were not a good idea at the beginning but were not gotten rid of because the agency issued the rule and then declared victory and went on, there are teams now at the departments that are available to try to get that fixed. It isn't quite a sunset provision, but it could serve many of the same functions.
Thank you very much. And let me just ask you one more question, if you'll indulge me. I get the sense that in some areas of the government, there is let's look for a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. It may be that there are people in jobs that say, I need to make my job relevant, or some sort of mindset where let's do something where there isn't a problem. I mean, it's outside the it's probably too small potatoes to be on your plate. We have an example in the district I represent in South Texas where the National Park Service wants to lower the speed limit on the Padre Island National Seashore from 25 to 15 miles an hour to protect the endangered Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, when there's never been one incident on the Padre Island National Seashore of a turtle being hit by a car. Do you have any thoughts on things we could do to maybe just change the mindset of to let's justify my job, let's have more regulations, let's make it harder to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mentality?
In the rulemaking area, we are very conscious of the need, as the President said the other night, to show that the rule is required. And what served, I think, both Republican and Democratic administrations in good stead in this domain, it's just a small part of the whole government, of course, is to require right off the bat a description of the market failure or other problem that justifies regulation. If you can't get over that threshold by saying there's a market failure or other problem, then you probably should devote yourself to some other issue.
Well, I appreciate your taking the time to come and testify before this committee. I look forward to seeing you again, and I would like to commend you on the job you are doing. It's a big one. And again, thank you very much for testifying.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And with that, we're done.